Hello everybody and welcome to a very special stream today on a Wednesday. I know, it's a bit out of schedule, for our usual streams. We usually live on Thursday, but today we have some special content we want to show to you. And for that, Mr. Convoy is here, not just me, Chrysantas. We have him in the background. He's actually making sure that this stream is going to run very smoothly because we have a lot of cool things we want to show you.
Hello.
But I'm not alone here. We also have the very beautiful Mr. Taki here with us. Hello, Taki.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. And you might all wonder, what is this stream about? Well, especially if you didn't check out our portal articles. But it's basically very simple. This is a special stream for a special occasion because in just 2 days we will have a very special anniversary. The 75 years since the end of the World War II in Europe. Well, depends on which region, but it's getting close, and especially with all those lockdowns going on, we wanted to just use the opportunity to prepare something special for you, prepare a stream that we hope that you will enjoy and that will try to connect the game and the real history, especially the often overlooked history of the World War II, the naval history of World War II in the European waters.
Absolutely, and that means we're going to have a very history-focused stream today with a lot of special guests that we'll get to in a few minutes. But just that you know what's going to happen. So we invited a few guests that are going to talk about the questions that you sent us on your regional forums. Thank you very much for sending us some very interesting questions over there. So we'll do a little bit of a Q&A session with the guys, talk about, the history and the aspect of naval warfare during World War II. And then we'll have an online naval parade where we actually created a special room for it, where we have a special map. And then we will talk about some of the ships that participated in World War II in detail and show them to you in a way that you probably haven't seen them before, with some, cool information, background stories, and I hope you will enjoy it. And after that, if we have a little bit of time left, we are happy to do a bit of a free Q&A session. It's just something I want to highlight. The first part will be a bit more organized in terms of Q&A. We wanted to collect some in-depth questions, and because it takes some time to also research that material, we wanted to hand these questions to our guests in advance so that they have some time to prepare and give you a really detailed answer. But that's not the only thing. Obviously, World of Warships, we are going to have a Victory Day event as well. So there will be some cool stuff coming. You might have seen that already beforehand in our development blog. We are bringing some really nice Victory Day anniversary camouflages. You can see them in the background. And you are not able to get them today just yet. They will be being available in the game starting tomorrow or on Friday, depending on where you're at. And some of them will be available through missions, and some of them will be available for you just to buy if you like them. But since we're here today with a special stream, we actually created a giveaway for you guys where you can win, for example, an Alabama, an Eagle, Duke of York, Texas, or Oktyabrskaya Revolucja with those special camouflages, one of each that you can win. And then we also have a few packages of the permanent camouflages that we introduced for Tech Tree ships, like the, what do we have? The Implacable, the Minsk, and the New Orleans. And just as a little additional giveaway for those of you who also would like to get some consumable camouflages, we also put up 50 sets each of 5 MS-21 camouflages and the Sparks of Victory fitting to the name of the day. How to participate? It's very straightforward. All you have to do is follow the link that we're dropping in chat on all of the platforms. What you have to do then is you click on the link, you log in with your account just to verify that this is your account, and then you are automatically participating as soon as you click the participate button. That's all you got to do. We will be drawing the winners randomly towards the end of the stream, and then you will get a message in-game. You don't have to stick around for the entire stream, right? If we draw you, you will get your prize regardless of whether you're here or not, so nothing to worry about. Yes. Yeah, Taki, I'm really hyped to have this stream. It's very different in content.
It's different. I don't think we did stuff like this for Warships yet. And yeah, it will be very, very interesting.
Yes, and I already see some comments in chat. Well, if you clicked on participate, you will already, you're already in. If it says you're already participating, it means you clicked on the participate button and it should be fine.
Someone is reporting 403 forbidden.
Just open it in a different browser. It's probably just your browser that is. Yes,
this is a common browser, common problem. Switch browser and it will work.
Exactly. Yes, and obviously, guys, I'm not an expert for history. That's not my specialty here for naval history. Taki is much more informed about the naval history of World War II.
Yes, but I don't think I'm informed enough. So for today's stream, we decided to invite someone who really has a lot of information, far more than we would be able to provide by ourselves.
Not just one person, actually. Yes. We got 4 really big heavyweights in terms of naval history knowledge. And welcome, guys. We have a lot of guys for you that are going to be talking about history. And we're going to go through them one by one. If you don't know them, we'll do a quick introduction so you know who's who and why they're here. And then we'll switch over to the Q&A. So welcome, guys. And welcome, James D. Hornfisher. I'm very happy to have you here on our stream. How are you doing, sir?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to join you all. I so enjoy the game World of Warships, and I spend too much time playing it when I should be writing my books. I've published 4 books on the Pacific campaigns of World War II, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, about Taffy 3 at Leyte Gulf, Neptune's Inferno about the Guadalcanal campaign, Ship of Ghosts about the old martyred USS Houston here, and then my most recent book about the Marianas campaign, Fleet at Flood Tide, which covers the end game of the war from Operation Forager all the way through the atomic bombings of Japan. In the game, you'll find me playing as Neptune's Inferno. I spend a lot of time driving U.S. cruisers and battleships to their doom, and so enjoy the game as a reflection of my original interest in naval history, which was wargaming and model building as a kid. I mean, these Avalon Hill war games, Monogram and Ravel plastic models, the old documentaries, War at Sea, Black Sheep Squadron on Thursday nights on NBC. All of it just fired my interest in naval history, and I can only imagine what this game platform is doing for the 14 and 15-year-olds out there who are playing it in terms of firing their interest in these beautiful ships and what they can do when they go into harm's way. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about all this and to bring the history to life and to cast some light on people's questions about the history through the prism of the game, which is so well done. So congratulations on its success, and it's a pleasure to be here.
It's so great to have you here, and guys, as you can hear, he will have 1 or 2 things probably to say about naval history and all of the questions that you guys sent over. And then we have the Chieftain here from our own company, from Wargaming. Hello, Chieftain. Oh, we can't hear you right now.
That would help if I unmuted the mic.
Perfect.
Yes.
So I'm trying not to type. Okay, my apologies. Good morning from Central Texas, or good afternoon or good evening, depends where in the world you are. So I'm possibly the odd man out here because people will know me mainly as being a tanker. You see tanks in the background, and my book is on tank destroyers, not ships. But little known fact, I was actually into great big grey floaty things before I got into tanks. And back in the day, I was well known in the Harpoon wargaming community for doing all various ship forms and so on. I prefer Cold War, but anyway. And, well, surprise, surprise, they asked me to show up and make a few comments. So let's see if I can actually hold my weight against this, the might of Jingles, Hornfisher, and Drakenfell. So if nothing else, I'll make smart comments in a fun accent.
Perfect. I thought it was my job.
And now you got competition.
Oh, okay. I'll take you on that. And then we have also Drakenfell for the very first time here on this channel. Welcome.
Hello, welcome. Well, I suppose you're welcoming me. So, yeah. So, as the name suggests, I'm Drakenfell, curator of the channel of the same name. I'm here, obviously, because you were very kind enough to ask me to do so. My interest in naval history goes back pretty much to about the time I could walk, when on an unusually sunny day, I know sun is somewhat heretical in England, but there you go, I found myself walking into Portsmouth Naval Dockyard, courtesy of my grandmother, and the first thing a little 4-year-old Drac saw was HMS Victory in the glory of the noonday sun with all masts and yards set. So at that point, that was pretty much it. That's going to be my main interest from then on. And so that eventually brought me to starting up the channel. That brought me then to yourselves, and obviously to this stream, where of course, whilst we are all enjoying ourselves, it is also important to remember that this is a stream to remember those who gave their lives in all forms of combat, but obviously especially the naval side of things, during what so far has been the largest and most destructive war that we've seen.
Absolutely. And then, last but not least, obviously our mighty Jingles. Hello, Jingles.
Howdy,
How you
folks. So, yes, the mighty Jingles here. Self-proclaimed rock star, horse thief, brain surgeon, and noob gamer extraordinaire. I've made a career out of being crap at games, so you don't have to. Obviously, I have the YouTube channel. Got into gaming, well, initially through World of Tanks, but then when I heard that news World of Warships was coming out, as a 22-year veteran of Her Majesty's Grey Funnel Shipping Lines, also known as the Royal Navy, shut up and take my money. I've been here ever since, with a particular interest in history in general, naval history in particular, although you could argue, since I was in the Royal Navy and I am very, very old, I am actually naval history myself. So what better person could you possibly have to join us on a stream discussing naval history?
Great.
Indeed.
As you can see, a lot of knowledge already assembled here. And the good thing is we're going to get into our Q&A session. I just wanted to give a big shout out to the guys who sent over questions. And as a little thank you for all of those who sent over questions that we picked for the Q&A session, we are actually going to send over to you a Hornfisher book. So we will contact you via forums because you submitted your questions over there. So we have an easy way to contact you. So please pay attention to your personal messages from us. You know, if you see a message probably from Mr. Convoy, he's just there not to spank you, but to give you something nice. So please open that message and reply and tell us where you live so we can send you over one of those books. We would have actually loved to get them signed and then send them over, but with the current COVID situation, it's not that easy.
The logistics got slightly harder. As well as actually picking up the questions, because there was a lot of them, and we had to do some selection because, well, the time is still a constraint, but I think we have a very, very nice and very interesting selection here.
Yes, before you get into the questions, I just wanted to say one thing. Chat, I can see there are already 4,000 of you. Amazing. So I hope you all are going to have fun with this stream. I just wanted to reiterate, today's stream is going to be about Victory Day and naval history. I know that you have a lot of questions about the game and all of the things that are going to be happening in the game very soon. We're not going to have time to go into that today. But you are absolutely fine to join us tomorrow for our weekly English stream, where we're going to try to answer as many questions as we possibly can, as every Thursday. But please, if you have any questions today, try to think about questions that are interesting to you from that World War II period, especially about the European theater of battles. But obviously, if you have some other questions, we can shoot them over to our guests, and maybe they have an answer for that. And with that, let's go into the first question.
Okay, let's dive in. The first question was from Shorty Sunderland. Was there a reason that for the vital Arctic convoys of 1942 to 44, the modern Soviet destroyers Gniezny class, Leningrad class, Stroživoj class didn't escort the convoys all the way from their departure port to their destination port, but only from until somewhere half up the Barents Sea? British and American cruisers and destroyers did often sail all the way. Was it politics, technical limitations? That's a very, very interesting question, actually.
It is a good one, and fortunately, I happen to know somebody who can help me with the answer, so I did some asking. And the problem is mainly technical. So the modern destroyers, like the Project 7s, they actually were not all that liked, at least not up in Northern Fleet, which was primarily responsible for convoy escorts. The fleet commander preferred the older Novex. And the reason for that is their design. We'll be talking more about the Project 7 a little bit later, but the bottom line is that the design process for these ships was not very good. And one of the things that suffered was bunkerage. So although the things were designed with a cruising range of over 3,000 kilometers, in practice, they usually couldn't do more than about 1,600 to 2,000. And oftentimes they would have to offload ammunition from the magazine and fill it with fuel instead, just to get from A to B.
That's not too practical.
That is a bit of a flaw in the design. And so as a result, obviously there's only so far that these modern ships could go. And oftentimes they would simply go to maybe the 30 Easting and pick up the escort from there and then continue on the rest of the way. Now, that's not to say that they were inherently bad designs, but for convoy escort duty, not so fantastic. And they had some other limitations as well, which I'll get into when we start talking about those in details. But the bottom line is that the modern Soviet destroyers were just not suited for long-range operations, and especially not long-range operations in the North Atlantic.
Thank you very much.
I have to comment on this. So, Jingles, chat is very, very obsessed with your cat. Now you have to do an official introduction. We cannot have an unknown guest.
Okay,
here.
This is Juicy. She's Dutch, by the way, and she's a big old unit. I'm not sure where Akazuki is. She's probably sleeping somewhere. But yes. Oh, Jim didn't know. I have another cat named Akazuki. Yeah, she's the baby of the family. Juicy here is 9 years old, and she's a real angel.
It already stealing the show, huh?
Yeah.
It's we have a lot of meetings obviously online these days, and the pets, I think, play a bigger and bigger role in those meetings.
Yes. Yes, they do indeed.
Yeah, and then we can already go to the next question. That question was actually sent in from Past the Salt, a very fitting nickname in World of Warships sometimes, right? And he was asking, naval history is full of tales of valor and heroism. Which of the many naval actions of World War II stands out to you as the most audacious?
Last stand of the tin can sailors.
I think we
Honest to
were
God,
talking.
it's hard to avoid singling out the battle off Samar, part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 25th, 1944, where Little Taffy 3, Task Unit 77.4.3, is handed to it by the fates to square off against the greatest battleship task force ever sent to sea by any navy. We're talking about the Imperial Japanese Center Force, commanded by Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita. Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, 6 heavy cruisers, any number of 2 divisions of destroyers, a pair of light cruisers, and they came down bone on teeth on top of this little escort carrier task unit, which threw itself into the fray for 2.5 hours in broad daylight on the morning of October 25th, 1944, and ended up turning them back. How does this happen? Well, can we credit the fog of war, perhaps? At the height of the engagement, Admiral Kurita has no other conclusion than that he is facing Halsey's Third Fleet. Why? Well, because it starts with Captain Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston, who charges solo, turns, left rudder out of his screening station astern the fleeing escort carrier group, and takes his little Fletcher, bone and teeth at 36 knots, against the entirety of the Japanese force, laying smoke, zigzagging, chasing salvos, finally releasing a spread of 10 torpedoes, which has the effect of blowing the bow off the lead Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. A second cruiser stands by to take away survivors and lend assistance, and next thing you know, the initiative is in the Americans' hands. Before long, you have TBM Avengers making dummy runs, firing rockets, dropping depth charges, strafing again when they're out of ordnance. They make dummy runs with their torpedo bay doors open, bluffing the Japanese time and time again. The rest of the screen forms up and attacks. Evans returns to station laying smoke and then follows in the other DDs to lend gunfire support, of all things. 5-inch gunfire against cruisers and battleships. And it makes a difference. These guys lay it on the line. They lay it out there. They take heavy losses. And they convince Kurita he's facing, by God, Admiral Halsey. So 2.5 hours into this thing, finally, it takes some time before we get some properly loaded aircraft attacking the Japanese. Taffy 2 to the south weighs in with TBMs dropping AP bombs and torpedoes. They put down 2 more Japanese cruisers, and Kurita finally concludes he's not going to achieve his objective. Faced with this opposition, he turns back from mere miles from reaching Leyte Gulf and MacArthur's transport anchorage. And 4 U.S. ships are down, 3 Japanese are down, and Admiral Ziggy Sprague, the American task unit commander, is left to credit the definite partiality of Almighty God for the fact that anybody survived from his task unit. Just a stunning outcome. You ask about audacity, so I hereby submit Taffy 3 as the most audacious naval unit ever to sail into harm's way.
Okay, so let's change this question around a little bit then. So Taffy, obviously, not only was there a lot of valor, it was also a huge and significant fight. But valor is also found at the individual or smaller level. So, I mean, the chances are that there is a lot of valorous engagements which are simply overlooked by most historians. Now, okay, let's take a smaller example, Hipper versus Glowworm, which may be overstated, but one small little destroyer against an armored cruiser. If you start going down to those really small levels, the PT boats, things like that, what would you say would be an example of extreme valor that just doesn't get the news because it wasn't war turning, as opposed to just not being valorous?
Well, they do get some publicity, but probably not as much as they should. Which I would put forward the engagements of Rawalpindi and Jervis Bay, along with Beaverford, against German raiders, because they knew full well that they were going to die. In fact, in one of the engagements, one of the captains actually went into the engagement and said, basically, yes, I know I'm going to die. We're going to fight them. They're going to sink us. That'll be it. And still, because he knew that every minute he bought was a minute that the rest of the convoy would have a chance to get away, he then, both of them actually, then drove their converted merchant ships at full-scale Kriegsmarine surface raiders, and obviously the ships and their crews paid a very heavy price for that. But it takes a lot of audacity to sit there and go, well, as one of the faster units in this convoy, I might get away, or I could maybe fire a few guns for honor's sake and try and draw them away. It's a whole other level to be staring death in the face and just turn around and go, right, in we go then. And that is pretty much that. The same attitude pretty much that's displayed by Captain Evans, but on a smaller scale with a significantly less capable vessel.
Any love for any of the civilians, like SS Oklahoma as part of Operation Pedestal? Never give up, never surrender.
Actually, for me, that would be actually Drachenifel reminded me one also very audacious episode. When the 2 Japanese merchant traders, the Hokoku and Taikoku Maru, caught up with the Dutch tanker Ondina, armed with 1 4-inch gun, and the Indian minesweeper Bengal, armed with 1 13-pounder gun. And these 2 ships, managed to sink one of the raiders, and both survived. So that was, I would say, very unequal fight and very lucky outcome, actually.
I need to correct myself already. It was Ohio, not Oklahoma.
Yeah, the tanker.
The tanker that they thought had sunk and they abandoned, and then found it floating again the next day and thought, you know what, we can salvage this, and sailed it into Malta Harbour.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And to put a slightly different spin on the word audacious in terms of just sheer, okay, hats off to you for even pulling that off in the first place. I think a good big shout out has to go to the Italian frogmen, and not the ones you're thinking of, not the ones that sank Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, because that was good, but they did get caught immediately after. I'm talking about the ones who ended up randomly blowing up ships in Gibraltar for the better part of 2 years, because no one ever figured out how they were doing it, or that they were even there. It was just a case of every so often a merchant ship in Gibraltar Harbour would explode and everyone would panic and wonder what was going on. And it turned out there was an entire Italian manned torpedo operation going on from a converted merchant ship hulk on the other side of the harbour. No one knew until after the Italians the Italian armistice was signed, and then they sort of popped up and said, "Yeah, by the way, we were over here the entire time."
Okay,
that's audacity.
That's audacious.
Absolutely. And then there were ships that had no business surviving. On that illustrious roster, we have to put, USS Laffey off Okinawa, taking 6 kamikaze hits and 6 bombs. The captain was finally faced with the choice of maintaining speed to avoid further attack or slowing down to avoid whipping the fires that were consuming his ship. Laffey finally survives, against all odds off Okinawa, and it just goes to show what those picket destroyers faced under concentrated kamikaze attack. Deployed oftentimes alone, maybe in the company of some kind of a LST or something to provide support, but generally all by themselves. And the Japanese kamikazes, when they couldn't find a carrier, they'd go after these picket destroyers in a very concentrated way. And what chance should Laffey have had? And yet she survived. And you can visit her to this day. Laffey is there at Patriots Point, South Carolina, alongside USS Yorktown. And if you're ever there, go tip the cap to one of the gallant ships of the war. But that's audacious, surviving when you had no business doing so with heavy loss of life. So just have to hand it to those destroyermen. They could survive against all odds, time and time again.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys, for that very detailed answer. Thank you. I think it's one of the most interesting topics also. Really like what Chieftain brought up, that there are probably a lot of things that are not as highlighted as the very popular stories where there was still a lot of valor and heroism actually involved and trying to fend off the enemy.
Of course, there's a lot that nobody knows at all because everybody died.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
unfortunately.
And there is a time for another question from /B/. In your opinion, what was the best battleship, and why was it the Bismarck?
Oh, don't even get me started on Bismarck. People who see my videos know exactly what I think of that ship. I guess I'll lead off with this one. In my opinion, the best battleship is the one that you get the greatest return on investment for. So how many actions did it take part in? How much success did it bring the Navy in question? And how much did it affect the outcome of the war? And in actuality, that means that a lot of the bigger ones that everyone goes on about generally actually score fairly low on that scale. You think about something like Yamato; it's the biggest, most heavily armed, along with Musashi. Doesn't actually do that much during the war, apart from act as an XP pinata for the U.S. Navy's air arm. But if you look at something like my personal favorite, which will come as no surprise to most people, which is HMS Warspite. That ship manages to fight its way through so many different engagements. It actually has a fairly naval war-changing engagement at Narvik, as well as surviving a Fritz X, which put down the much more modern battleship Roma, and made it all the way through to the end of the war. So for the amount of money the Royal Navy invested in that ship, they more than got their money back on that. So as a return on investment and as an example of sheer tenacity, I would put forward Warspite as best battleship.
Yeah, I was going to say the Dreadnought, simply, for obvious reasons. It rendered every other battleship in existence at the time, whether it already existed or was in construction, obsolete overnight. Although the USS South Carolina came bloody close. America started building it first, but we just built ours faster. But no, I'm going to go with the Warspite as well, because Warspite.
Well, I'll have to speak up for the Pacific U.S. fleet here and hold up USS Washington as perhaps an example worth discussing. I like return on investment as a metric here, and Washington had the distinction of putting down Kirishima in a one-on-one surface action on the night of November 13th, 1942. When you talk about best battleships, you can talk about hardware, but you also have to talk about people. Now, I suppose we could say that a North Carolina-class battleship at 7,000 yards did to a Congo what it should have done that night. 16-inch AP at that range is going to cause some damage, and Kirishima took a face full of it, courtesy of Willis Lee's ship. Willis Lee, Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee, was the U.S. Surface Force commander that night, and he was a stickler for tactical training. He drilled his turret crews, his fire control crews rigorously in the days leading up to that engagement. And it goes to the idea that we can't just talk about ships and hardware. We have to talk about the people operating the systems. Lee had come from Washington, where he was director of tactical training. He was author of tactical publications governing the use of, the shortwave fire control radar systems, the SG radar coming into the fleet at that time. He may have been the only man capable of doing what he did that night in terms of preparing his crew to use this new technology to best effect. And the proof of that, I think, comes from the example 2 years later, where Lee is given the opportunity after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot to go hunting for the Japanese surface fleet at night. Spruance asks him if he wants to take his 6 battleships and go hunting. And he declines. Why does he decline? He declines because for 2 years, all his battleships have been doing are riding in a ring, providing anti-aircraft support to the carrier task groups. They've kind of forgotten how to fight at night, or at least he has not had the opportunity to drill to his own high personal standard. And so knowing this and knowing that, night surface action is risky and that the Japanese are pretty damn good at it, he declines the opportunity. And it had to do with his awareness that his crews were just not up to the task in the summer of 1944, the same way they were 2 years prior, when all he did was train them for night action. So in spite of his glittering record and the fact that Washington had this formidable main battery, which had been so well used, when Lee is given a chance to reprise it 2 years later, he turns it down because his men just weren't trained for the job. And I think that's got to factor into any conversation about which battleship will beat any other given battleship, is how good the fire control crews are, how good the main battery director guys are, the guys down the central station, the loaders, the hot shellmen, the whole team. And so, a good commander's got to stand on top of his men and understand their state of training. And that was Willis Lee. He fought when he knew he had the chance and was ready for it, and he wisely declined and let the carrier task groups carry the day in the Marianas in 1944, 2 years after his great glory at Guadalcanal. So I would point to crew training as a major factor in any discussion of which is the so-called best ship.
Somebody's asking if you appreciate foreign ships that aren't American as well.
Well, of course.
But,
of course, the Japanese Navy were the masters of nighttime torpedo warfare in 1942, and you have to credit what they did at Guadalcanal, Savo Island, as a master class. And so the great challenge that we faced was to match them, to match the Tokyo Express in nighttime combat power. And the U.S. Navy had certain advantages, but the Japanese were very, very well trained and had rigorously drilled very realistically all through the early war years, fighting in China and preparing their surface units for combat, which they demonstrated a ferocious capability and were the reigning masters of this mode of warfare for the first several years of the war, no question. So yeah, no, I'm no just xenophobia or anything.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with Drax's return on investment statement, because by that argument, you look at the Iowas that are still being flagships and shelling the enemies of the United States 5 decades after they were built. But I think you are on the right track when it comes down to things like reliability and efficiency, even if they don't actually see the level of combat. I mean, what you really want is you want a ship that will float, is not going to be stuck in a dry dock when you need it. Issues like that. Now, unfortunately, I'm not well versed enough in the world's battleships specifically to come up with a particular personal favorite for that. But I do think that your criteria needs a little modification.
Well, on the question of reliability, yeah, you're not wrong, but it's a lot more relevant when it applies to tanks, because tanks only have one engine and one gun. Warships, there's a lot of redundancy built in. Multiple boilers, multiple engines, multiple gun systems, multiple fire directors, and yeah, it's not unusual for any ship to be at sea, and one or more of those diesel generators or boilers is on the fritz. But because that redundancy is built in, the question of reliability, while it's not insignificant, isn't as much of an issue in naval warfare.
Yeah, and with battleships, it also tends to almost conflate with durability, because returning back to the example of Warspite and the Fritz X, that Fritz X that was it for X turret. That X turret was out of the war for the rest of World War II, but Warspite's still there at D-Day, still quite happily chugging around and blowing Germans away with its remaining 3 turrets. So.
And that applies to the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor as well. I mean, how many of them were raised, sailed back to the US, refitted, and sent out again?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But again, if it's not well designed from the beginning to allow for upgrades, I mean, changing out a power plant is not an insignificant thing. Is that taken into account during the design process, or if not?
I don't really think that's taken. Refits are planned when the technology becomes available and the money's available and the need is there. I mean, Warspite was built 1913, commissioned 1915. I don't think you got a first major refit until 1934. It's not quite the same as, for example, well, if you look at the Spitfire, there were 24 different versions of that. You look at the BF-109, like 8 or 9 different versions of that, constantly being upgraded. Again, it's a different field of engineering. And you also have to bear in mind that not every Queen Elizabeth class battleship is the same as every other Queen Elizabeth class battleship. Not every Iowa is the same as every other Iowa. They may all be the same class, but there are going to be differences. Plans change, blueprint requests come in from the contractors during construction, requests come in from the Admiralty during construction. Yeah, we'd actually like some of this. Well, the contracts change all the time, even if they're not. Even if they are the same class of ships, and it'll be the same with the Fletchers, regardless of how many of them you make, they're not all the same. There's that constant tinkering going on, and every time they would come in for a maintenance period, it wouldn't even have to be a refit. There would be work going on. The smell of welding is a constant when you're on a ship in a dockyard. It's just happening all the time. So yeah, definitely a factor. I mean, you want reliable engines, you want reliable gun systems, you want reliable radar and fire directors, but these are fantastically expensive pieces of equipment. So to one degree, you have to try to get the most bang for the buck, but you don't want to be putting them to sea with less than the best that you can afford. I can't help but feel that I varied slightly off topic there.
Slightly, a little bit, yes.
We don't want to interrupt you, because I think this is one of the coolest aspects of having all of you here, to be able to discuss things because what is the best ship? It's like such a common question for us as well, and any player of the game, right, who's going to talk to another player, like, hey, what's your favorite ship? And then also to see, like, from a historical point of view, what people think, that it's not always the Yamato or always the Bismarck, but they actually, like other ships that deserve that, like, let's say, favorite spot in your heart for the best battleship, which is obviously a very subjective thing.
Although obviously the answer is the Warspite.
Yes.
It's a weird way to spell Bismarck, I have to say. I'll let it pass. There was actually a question from chat about the Fritz X. Could you maybe explain what that was for somebody who's not really into history?
Okay, so basically the Fritz X is one of, or the, depending on which sources you go for, the first guided weapon, air-to-surface guided weapon. It's not like, and I keep getting the numbers the wrong way around, but it's something like HS 293 or something along those lines, which is actually a guided missile. The Fritz X is actually a guided bomb. It doesn't have its own propellant, but it is a absolutely massive remote-controlled bomb with fins on the back, so you can guide it in somewhat. And the idea is basically you just fly around at a very high altitude, drop this absolutely monstrous thing, and down it goes, and it just smashes straight through the deck armor of a ship, and it hopefully explodes somewhere deep inside the ship, which, with the kind of warhead it's carrying, will just total pretty much anything it hits. And there are quite a few Allied ships that get put down by that in one or two hits. As I mentioned, the Roma, that's a very big 40,000 ton plus Italian Littorio class battleship, gets hit by a couple of Fritz X's, one of which sets off the main magazines, and that's all she wrote for Roma. A number of other, as I say, various Allied cruisers either took damage or were very bad or were sunk by them. In some ways, actually, it was a little bit too effective, believe it or not, because A number of Allied ships that actually survive because the Fritz X goes straight through the armored deck, straight through the rest of the ship, out the bottom, and keeps going into the ocean before detonating somewhere underneath, which actually does a bit less damage than it would have done if the bomb had slightly less penetration capability and actually still exploded inside the ship. But I suppose a lot of crews of Allied ships are probably not complaining about that aspect there.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the explanation. We're going to move on to the next question, which is actually from Sir Dixie. From Ottoby. And he's asking, did the Allied submarine forces ever try the Wolfpack strategy that the Germans used since it was so effective?
They didn't really need to. There wasn't really any need for a Wolfpack tactic on the Allied side. I mean, the Germans weren't transporting vast amounts of goods across the Atlantic in convoys. And the Japanese weren't even assembling convoys for merchant ships until 1943, late in 1943. Plus, the amount of goods, I mean, obviously Japan was heavily reliant on imports. That's why they got into the war in the first place. But they were transporting stuff from all over the Pacific, from a much, much wider area that couldn't effectively be covered by wolf packs of submarines. And the Americans were doing a bang-up job just by assigning single submarines to patrol boxes and just letting them sink whatever they came across. It was working. So there wasn't really the need for it on the American side in the Pacific, the way the Germans employed it to, a lot of success up until about mid-43 in the Atlantic. And for the Allies in the Atlantic, they weren't the ones hunting convoys. So again, no real need for it.
Yes, that leaves the Mediterranean, going from Italy to North Africa.
Yes. Well, Malta, obviously, was Malta and Gibraltar were both fairly important there. But again, only up until the defeat of the Africa Corps of the Italian army in North Africa. In fact, the failure to reduce Malta and force its capitulation, Rommel himself even said that unless you can conquer Malta, I can't quote him exactly, but if you can't take Malta out of the equation, then we will only end in defeat in North Africa. The British submarines operating in the Mediterranean enjoyed quite a lot of success interdicting convoys traveling from Italy and France to Tripoli, but don't believe they ever used the Wolfpack tactics. But then again, they were having pretty high success rates, so didn't really need to.
Yeah, the thing you've got to remember for submarines of all sides in the Mediterranean is not a pleasant place to be if you're a submarine.
So it's quite shallow.
Shallow, it's clear, it's very easy to spot you, and with it being a relatively speaking enclosed environment, it's much more likely someone's going to come across you than if you're on the surface recharging your batteries as compared to in the middle of the Atlantic. So if you're going to start grouping lots of submarines together in the Mediterranean, that's really just lining up a very nice target group, because if you have that density of submarines, someone's going to get spotted, and then the anti-submarine warfare assets are going to come out. I believe, if I remember correctly, and Mr. Hornfisher may be able to shed a little bit more light on this, but if I recall correctly, later in the war, it wasn't the full Kriegsmarine or Wolfpack tactic, but there were some hunting groups of US submarines that were set up when the resources were available.
The South China Sea, they started calling it Convoy College because, we did such a... the U.S. submarines, Wahoo, look at Mush Morton's record, Wahoo and Tang and all these, high-scoring subs. By the end of the war, the submarine force, the Pacific, had shut down Japanese commerce. And the moral choice for the end game became, well, do we sustain blockade and bombardment, or do we drop nukes on Japan to force them to surrender? And the Navy wanted to continue the submarine cordon, but that could very well have led to a famine in Japan that would have been worse than the losses in the atomic bombings. So the submarine blockade was tremendously effective. It was enabled by air search and a lot of good radio communications, and we had overlapping patrol systems in the South China Sea, which cut off Japan from all their resources in Indonesia and the Philippines. It was tremendously effective.
Yeah, but as Jingles pointed out, the thing is with the Japanese, there's only so much you can do, because there's not a formal rigid convoy system. It's all very diffuse for a lot of the war. And to be perfectly honest, all credit to the US submariners. By the time there were sufficient US submarines in the area and the Japanese were down to few enough ports that you could begin to think about a full-scale Wolfpack-style tactic, the US subs had sent so many Japanese ships to the bottom that it wasn't really worth it, because you would have ended up with more subs in the area than there were targets, which could have led to some interesting arguments. They'd have to form an orderly
queue. The Japanese
queue.
never quite mastered anti-submarine warfare either. I mean, they sank a few of our subs, but their destroyer force was focused on surface action with their torpedoes, and they never mastered the torpedo, sonar stack, or the use of sonar, and they never had anything beyond really the standard depth charge. It was very effective.
Well, I guess you can go into a whole
And
argument
operating
as
too
to
fast.
how the culture of the military affects their doctrine and operations. I mean, the Japanese were extremely aggressive oriented. The open battle was ideal, and it's like logistics in the German army in World War II. It's not cool. We don't care about it, and we'll just sort of hand wave the problem away and ignore it. And of course, ASW is the Japanese equivalent.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
The torpedo for the Japanese was as much a primary weapon of their ships as the guns. The amount of prestige available to a torpedo or a gunnery officer was far in excess of that to an engineering officer, an anti-submarine warfare officer, a depth charge officer. That's kind of what you got, the job that you got into if you didn't do very well at the Japanese Naval Academy. There's another conversation killer for you.
That's just the last word from Jingles.
So I guess now it's time for the Sir Dixie.
Yes.
So Sir Dixie's question, how do you think the result of Convoy PQ17 would have differed if the Admiralty was not so concerned about losing a US warship and ordered the covering forces to stay and potentially engage torpedoes instead of scattering the convoy?
This is a very interesting circumstance because, to be honest, the way it could have gone down if the convoy didn't scatter and Tirpitz had continued on, because remember the Tirpitz was ordered to turn around, but assuming that it wasn't and it kept going, then you can see why the Admiralty said that ordered the convoy to scatter, because at the end of the day the heavy covering force at that point is 4 heavy cruisers. The Germans are sailing with Tirpitz and Admiral Hipper, and with the best will in the world, unless you end up with a Battle of the North Cape style situation where nobody can see past their own face and you're having to rely purely on radar, in any other kind of circumstance, Tirpitz is probably quite capable of dealing with that escorting force unless it does something truly monumentally stupid. The more interesting thing, of course, is the fact that the whole thing is brought about by German signals intelligence, because they managed to keep Tirpitz and Hipper from sailing until after they know that King George V, Washington, and Victorious have turned back. Now, the interesting thing is, although the Germans didn't know, the Allied battleships had orders not to progress further east than Bear Island unless Tirpitz had come out, because they didn't see the point of exposing those heavy ships to extreme Luftwaffe air attack unnecessarily. And with Tirpitz not having sailed, at least at that point, they ordered the battleships to turn away, at which point, as I say, you're down to your 4 heavy cruisers. Now, if Tirpitz had sailed the day before and been spotted, those 2 ships would have stayed with PQ17, at which point fairly confident Washington and King George V can deal with Tirpitz, and I'm sure the other 4 heavy cruisers would fight amongst themselves to see who gets the Admiral Hipper kill. So yeah, it's basically a matter of timing, but with regards to the situation as it stood, I think the Admiralty probably made a reasonable call as far as when they believed Tirpitz was going in, telling the convoy to scatter. Obviously, as we know, Tirpitz didn't go in, and the convoy scattering ended rather badly for them. But hindsight, as they say, is a wonderful thing.
Yes, and once the convoy scatters, you see the impossibility of a single British carrier, Victorious, with her somewhat undercharged air group, to protect such a widespread convoy. Can you imagine if they had a proper carrier task group covering that convoy with 4 Essexes, where you could assign 2 as duty carriers providing combat air patrol for the scattering convoy, and then 2 additional carriers to suppress the German airfields with strikes. You've got a very different scenario, and so it was PQ17 has suffered its fate for failure of air cover because not only for the aforesaid reasons, but also aircraft are very effective weapons against U-boats as well, as we learned from the wolf packs we developed with the CVE hunter-killer groups. And so had there been more naval air power assigned to protect that convoy, you've got a very different outcome, I think.
I guess begs the question, I don't know the answer. Were Jeep carriers used in the Russia runs?
Eventually. There were escort carriers assigned to the convoys, but not at that stage of the war.
Yeah, one of the major problems with using escort carriers in that area of the world, which obviously, as Jingles mentioned, they did eventually solve, was the Arctic is not a forgiving environment. And a fleet carrier conducting air operations has certain advantages in terms of its sheer engine power and therefore speed. And to be honest, it's the distance above the waves that the flight deck is, whereas an escort carrier would tossed around very, very much more. And you don't want to be trying to land on an escort carrier's flight deck when it's covered in ice, unless you really want to go back airborne again for a short period of time in front of the ship.
Okay.
North Atlantic was no place for naval aviation. There's no question. Tough operating environment.
Yeah, thank you guys for answering this. The next question
is from Ditka Feddog. Given the ability of Regia Marina to more actively participate in World War II, what would the likely outcome have been? They had a formidable fleet, but given their somewhat limited ship production capabilities compared to the US, would their active participation likely been a difference maker and decisive, or would it have been, or would it have more simply prolonged the inevitable?
See, one of Italy's problems, or the Italian Navy's problem in World War II, was she lacked 2 things: steel and oil. And because she lacked steel and oil, she lacked a third thing: training. Just going back to what Jim said earlier, you can't put to sea, you can't train your crews. Now, a properly trained and motivated Navy was something that Italy lacked. If you give her the fuel, she can put to sea and train, but she then runs the risk of being sunk by the Royal Navy, and she can't replace her losses because she doesn't have any steel. If you were to give her all the steel that she needed, as well as all the fuel that she needed, she could put her ships out to sea and replace the losses eventually, because she has no industrial infrastructure. Although she could invest that steel in more infrastructure, so maybe in 15 years, she can sail, train, and replace losses quickly, none of which helps her in the Mediterranean in 1941. Which begs the question, if Italy had all of the steel and fuel that she wanted, why would she get into World War II in the first place? And the answer to that, of course, is Mussolini.
Yeah, and the other thing you've got to bear in mind is, again, it actually comes back to, again, what Jim was saying earlier about training and leadership, because the ships that they had were formidable. The Royal Navy certainly respected a lot of the ships that the Italians could put to sea. However, there's almost a 2-phase dichotomy to the whole thing. Before the Battle of Cape Matapan, the higher-ups in the Italian Admiralty, who, to be fair, are more political appointees than appointees on merit, are basically disregarding all the intelligence estimates as to what the British are going to come out against them with, which allows the Italian Navy to operate and fight a number of battles. After Matapan, they're seeing HMS Warspite hiding behind every rock, wave, and island in the Mediterranean, and they're absolutely terrified of sending anything out, which means that all you see after that really are small ship actions, destroyers, cruisers, torpedo boats, that kind of thing. And so even if they've got the ships and they've got the steel and they've got the oil, if the leadership isn't there to provide them with a clear direction, they're not going to be able to accomplish all that much. Give them the right leadership, and a bunch of oil and steel would definitely help, and it could be fairly decisive in the theatre. But at the end of the day, you've also got to remember the Mediterranean is one theatre of a much larger conflict. Whether or not Rommel is kicked out of North Africa, whether or not Italy is invaded, actually probably in the long term doesn't affect the final outcome of the war all that much. It's nice to do, But as long as you can hold North Africa, which is a very different proposition to trying to fight your way back and forth across the desert all the time, the decisive theatre for the European operations is obviously going to be on the Eastern Front and with the D-Day landings, and the Italian fleet is not going to be able to influence those.
I find it interesting your emphasis on Rommel in North Africa when the Italians had most of the forces.
Yeah, well, again, it comes down to leadership, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I had I had, because he's passed away now, but I had a great uncle who took part in that campaign, and from what he told me before he passed away, it was basically, as long as you could give the Italians good leadership, they could fight. But unfortunately, until the Africa Corps showed up, they were rather short on decent leaders at a strategic level, and you ended up with the Italian 10th Army surrendering to a small armoured patrol from 7th Armoured Division, who then quietly wondered how on earth they were going to march all the prisoners away without them cottoning on to the fact they were outnumbered about 20 to 1. But that's getting back onto land, which is not my natural environment.
The Italian Navy simply suffered from a permanent vulnerability to air power. There was no Italian naval aviation. They had no counter to Allied air power in the Med, and they would have been perpetually vulnerable in spite of the power of their surface squadrons to well-organized aerial reconnaissance and air attack. So that would have been their Achilles heel.
Is someone in chat asking you about an Italian carrier Aquila?
They were in the middle of trying to build a couple of them. They never got them completed.
Yeah, but building a carrier and actually effectively operating a carrier are two entirely different things. It takes years. And I'm not just the knowledge that you gain. Something that the US Navy picked on remarkably quickly during World War II. When you look at how quickly they were cycling aircraft off their flight decks in 1941 and 1942, and then the fine art that they'd gotten it down to by 1943 and 1944, that kind of knowledge it's organic knowledge that you have to keep using. You can't just click your fingers, build a carrier, and then be operating aircraft with anything like any kind of effectiveness or reliability or competence. It's something that takes years to learn. So yeah, they might have. Well, they probably wouldn't have been able to build their carrier, but even if they had, just having a carrier and making it useful are two entirely different things.
Is there a comment there about the fleet air arm in between the Harriers and the F-35s?
I wasn't going to say it. I was in the Royal Navy when they got rid of the Sea Harriers. Don't worry, it's fine, they said. You can use Royal Air Force Harriers. Yeah, but GR8s are bombers. They're not interceptors. Sea Harriers are interceptors. And they made redundant all of the flight deck handlers, all this knowledge, all of the senior rates that should have been kept on to train the next generation when the new carriers eventually came in. We're facing exactly the same problem now. It's going to take time to make our new carriers effective in exactly the same way, exactly the same problem that the Italians would have faced if they'd managed to get one built their own.
And with the F-35, we're taking time to a new state of the art. It's been 27 years since that bad boy has been in development, and we still don't have an operational squadron. News breaks last week. These things can't operate at supersonic speed because their wings might fall off, for God's sakes.
I understand that is a bit of a problem
for
when you're trying to fly.
It's considered suboptimal, yes.
I thought it was called variable geometry.
The program for the Marine
90 degree sweep back.
The program for the Marine Corps to replace the Amtrak was started in 1967, and they still haven't entered the replacement into service yet.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, so thank you guys. Then we'll move on to the next question that was sent in from Mark Train NPO, and he's asking as a current merchant mariner in the U.S. Navy, what was the typical rotation like for most merchant mariners, like during the Second World War period?
I actually had to do quite a bit of research into this. It's a very interesting question, one that I didn't actually know the answer to, and it turns out, well, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is between convoys, as little as a couple of days, as much as a couple of weeks, but probably no longer than that. The long answer is in May 1941, emergency work order notice number M198, making sure I'm quoting that correctly, was passed by the British Parliament in recognition of the situation that actually faced Great Britain at the time. Under this order, a merchant navy reserve pool was established because we had all of these hundreds of thousands of merchant sailors, but they weren't really being organized effectively. This basically ensured that all available seamen were allocated to ships that needed crew, and it required the seamen to continue to serve for the duration of the war. So they were a protected profession. They couldn't be called up and sent into the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force, but they were required to get on board those ships and sail those convoy routes. However, it wasn't all bad news for them, because they were actually guaranteed a wage for that period, including time spent in lifeboats. Because prior to this act, in May 1941, once you'd gotten sunk, you stopped getting paid. So if you were at sea for a couple of weeks in a lifeboat, it was on no pay. So, you know, that was a good thing. The act
what were you going to spend it on?
Well, exactly. Yeah, it's not like the NAFI was going to open or anything, but yeah. What it also did was it provided 2 days leave for every month that you served. So in the Shipping Federation, the chief mates and engineers of ships, because it might sound surprising, but it was only actually the captains, the chief mates, the masters, and the engineers who were actually stuck with the ship. The rest of the crew, all of the regular seamen, rotated. They often wouldn't serve on the same ship twice. So the masters, chief mates, and engineers would call out the Shipping Federation, looking for crews. They would append their names and destinations of their ships on a big chalkboard, big blackboard, along with their requirement for men. So available seamen would then be appraised, their paperwork would be checked, and they might be taken on if they were considered to be efficient and not a known troublemaker. They would then sign on by signing the ship's Articles of Agreement. Their name would then appear on the list of crew for the ship, and it would record the man's name, what rate he was assigned for that engagement, his rank in naval terms, what his rate of pay was, the name of his previous ship, his home address, and his signature at the end of the rope. On the subject of home address, most of these guys didn't actually have a fixed home address. Most of them lived in what were known as seamen's rests, which were like hostels in all the major ports that were there basically so sailors could have somewhere to sleep. After the foundation of the Ministry of War Transport and the introduction of the Merchant Navy Reserve Pool, this guaranteed continuity of employment for sailors and also served as the clearinghouse for available labour. See, when you left a ship, you would be told how much leave you were entitled to take, on what date, and at which port you had to report ready to return to sea. You were allowed some flexibility in what ship you would sign up for, but because you were required to continue serving as a merchant seaman, some people thought, well, I'll just say, no, that ship's not suitable for me, and I'll keep saying that, and maybe the war will be over. But you got 3 bites of the apple. 3 bites of the cherry. You could turn down the first ship you were assigned to, in which case you'd be assigned a second. You could turn down the second ship you'd be assigned to, in which case you'd be assigned a third. And if you turn down the third, well, tough luck. That's the ship you were assigned to. Crack on, Lofty. But the short answer to the question, 2 days leave for every month that you served on board a convoy ship. So it depended on how many convoys you'd accumulated before taking any leave. You could have a couple of weeks, but possibly no more than a day or two.
Okay,
these personnel policies are hugely important in the context of our topic today, which is Victory in Europe Day. After Hitler threw in the towel, the next frontier is the invasion of Japan. And there's a lot of talk about all the units and forces that were being transferred from Europe to the Pacific Theater to join to invade Imperial Japan. What you find is that it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, because much in line with what Jingles is talking about, the political pressure mounting on President Truman following Hitler's surrender in May of 45 was tremendous. America's mother said, "Bring my boy home." And there was a good case to do so. These guys had served from Anzio to Normandy on into the heart of Germany. And the War Department, Secretary Stimson, along with Army Chief of Staff Marshall, set up a point system to decide who'd be entitled to rotate home first. And what you find is all the experienced master sergeants and warrant officers entitled to cashier and go home. And so, okay, we're transferring the 8th Air Force under Jimmy Doolittle to Okinawa. What have they got left? Well, they got a bunch of B-29s, but where are their experienced aviation engineers to fly them, their bombardiers? Well, they're all going home. Same thing with the Army divisions, filling out the order of battle for Operation Olympic and Cornet. And so as MacArthur's taking stock of his the woefully inadequate intelligence estimates of the Japanese order of battle for the defense of the home islands. The estimates are constantly revising upward on the Japanese side, and the experience, the pool of experienced hands on the U.S. side is going down and down and down. The prospects for success in the invasion of Japan begin to look dim indeed. And so even as the Navy is imposing a blockade, and even as the B-29s are razing Japanese cities, the prospect of actually carrying off landings successfully with this threadbare force of greenhorns that we're preparing to send in there starts really raising the blood pressure at SINCPAC headquarters and Southwest Pacific headquarters in the Philippines. So these personnel policies are hugely important, and we should not overlook the fact that there was a personnel crisis settling in over the Pacific forces because of the political pressure that arose following a victory in Europe. Well, Hitler surrendered. Surely the war is over. Bring my sons home. And the army complied, and it did not look good indeed until Hirohito was forced to his senses by the second atomic bomb.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Boom.
guys, for all of the answers there. Chat, please let us know whether you like this concept. We're going to quickly, focus back on us. Thank you, guests, for the very informative section. We're going to be back with you in 2 or 3 minutes with the actual naval parade that a lot of you are waiting for. We're just going to do a little bit of a talk about the, just some infos on the stream, because there were a lot of questions. And so, Mr. Conway, you can switch. Thank you. So, guys, I know that a lot of you had questions about, a lot of naval history-related things, and unfortunately, we won't be able to ask these questions today too much. Maybe after the naval parade, we can ask a few more. Once we are done with this, I'm sure we can sit down and have another of these streams with more live Q&A from your side. Just wanted to say, I'm sorry that we cannot answer your questions today, probably, but I'm very, very happy to see that you like it and that you're very interested to also get your questions answered. We are dropping links in the chat for the channels that our guests are creating content on. For example, for Mighty Jingles or Drachinifel, you can find the content predominantly on YouTube, and I can highly recommend you to go check it out. For Mr. Hornfischer, go grab one of his books if you are anyone interested in the Pacific Theater. There's plenty of interesting stuff in those books, so I can highly recommend that. They're available wherever you are looking for. Google is your friend. Outside of that, so the links that we're dropping in chat are also including the giveaway that we're doing. All you have to do is sign up for it. So all you need to do is click on it, log in with your account on the correct region. If you get an error message, just try a different browser, and then you have to click on the participate button. As soon as you did that, it will tell you you're already participating, which is good. You're in the giveaway system, and we will do the raffling at the end of the stream. Okay, all of the questions regarding the game itself, we will be answering those questions tomorrow. Just join us for a regular weekly stream tomorrow with Taki and Lord of Droid. The twins are going to take a bit of a break because we've had a very busy week, so we're going to sit that one out.
You were streaming like crazy.
Yeah, we had Saturday stream for You're Not Alone. We had yesterday German stream, today this stream, and tomorrow I'll take a bit of a break, even though I love you guys. And now we're going to transition over to the naval parade, and how that's going to happen is, first of all, we're going to show you a bit the total parade, right? The lot of ships that we have lined up, and then we picked a few ships that our guests are going to talk about in particular because we think they have an interesting historical background, and do this for quite a few ships, and then come back to talk to you. So now we'll basically hand over and then be back. So thank you very much, and enjoy the naval parade.
Howdy folks, I have the honour of speaking first. I'm going to be talking about the ship that you can see here, or at least I can see here on my other monitor, HMS Campbelltown, the star of Operation Chariot, or the Greatest Raid as it came to be known. Operation Chariot was a plan to destroy the Normandy dry dock in the harbour of Saint-Nazaire, using a combined force of Royal Navy destroyers and motorboats. As well as British Army commandos. The Normandy dock, so named because that's where the SS Normandy cruise liner was built, was very important because it was the only French Atlantic dry dock capable of taking large warships like the Bismarck or the Tirpitz. So if ships like this had been damaged at sea, without this dry dock, they'd be forced to return to Germany for repairs. And in order to return to Germany for repairs, they would have to run through the gauntlet of the British Home Fleet, through either the English Channel or the North Sea, where they would be incredibly vulnerable. So the plan was to take the former US Navy USS Buchanan, a Wickes-class destroyer, obsolete Wickes-class destroyer, World War I vintage four-stacker, which had been renamed HMS Campbelltown when handed over to the Royal Navy under the Destroyer for Bases agreement. It was going to be packed full of explosives and rammed into the Normandy dock gates, at which point the commandos would jump out, blow up all the winding and pumping machinery, get back into the motorboats and sail back in home in time for tea and medals. That was the plan. Easy on paper, not so easy in practice. You see, the modifications that had been made to the Campbelltown in order to get her over the shallow shoals up the Loire estuary that led to the harbour in Saint-Nazaire meant that, in the words of her captain, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beattie, she was a bit of a pig to handle. 4.5 tons of high explosives, basically 24 depth charges, had been packed into the or around the support structure holding up her front gun. This had been encased in steel and concrete, and the fuses had been set just as she sailed, and then the fuses had been covered over with cement, so it was completely impossible to switch the bomb off after it had been lit. In an effort to try to lighten the ship, 2 of her funnels were removed, the other 2 were straked back so that her silhouette would resemble that of a German destroyer. She was also flying the German colours, as were the rest of the ships in the flotilla escorting her up the Loire. All of her torpedo tubes were stripped off, all unnecessary stores and equipment were removed, and she was only given enough fuel to make a one-way trip. So in the dead of night, while flashing German recognition signals, the Campbelltown and her flotilla of minesweepers and motor launchers proceeded down the Loire estuary until challenged, at which point Signalman Pike on board the Campbelltown responded in German. 2 damaged ships in company request permission to proceed without delay. This bought them another 5 minutes, and then all hell opened up. The flotilla was lit by multiple searchlights, and every gun in the harbour started shooting. Campbelltown, being the biggest target, took most of the fire. On the bridge, Chief Petty Officer Wellstead, who was steering the ship, was killed. His spot was taken by the quartermaster, who was also killed. Nigel Tibbets, the man who'd set the charges, buried in the ship, then took over, struggling to follow directions being shouted at him by Lieutenant Commander Beattie. Then the Old Mole jetty was sighted as it was briefly illuminated by a German searchlight, at which point Beattie knew exactly where he was, ordered hard over to port. Tibbets swung the wheel over. The ship's bell was rung to warn everybody to brace for impact. And then at precisely 1:34 a.m., only 4 minutes late, the ship smashed into the Normandy dock gates. Commandos leapt overboard from their motor launchers and disappeared into the buildings around the dock to blow up the pumping and winding machinery. You see, if the charges on the ship failed, the dock could still be taken out of action by destroying all of the pumping and winding machinery, making it impossible for them to flood and pump out the dry dock. Although this could be repaired a lot faster than the actual dry dock gates, but it would still take a period of at least 6 months. Other commandos fanned out through the dockyard to buy them time to get the job done. And finally, with all the charges set, it was time to get out. But most of the ships and boats had been damaged and sunk, and only 228 of the force of more than 600 men who took part would escape to England, the rest being either killed or captured when their ammunition ran out. By the time dawn broke, most of the fighting was over, but the charges from the Campbelltown, which had been set to go off at 7 a.m., still hadn't exploded. See, unfortunately, the pencil fuses that had been used to set the charges were notoriously unreliable. More effective and reliable timers had been in prototypes, but they weren't yet actually ready. It basically consisted of a length of piano wire with a small glass vial of acid. You break the vial, it burns through the piano wire, and then the charges go off. But it was affected by temperature. So if it was particularly cold, the charge might not go off at all. And if it was particularly hot, it might go off early. Tibbets had warned them that there might be a delay of anything up to 2 hours. No one was worried that the explosives would be found because they were encased in metal and concrete, and the timers had been, as we said, cemented shut after being the set. But if they hadn't gone off by 9:30, it would have been likely that they'd been damaged in the ramming and they were never going to go off. At 10 a.m., the ship was swarming with about 150 German troops. Beatty, the captain, was being interrogated by a German intelligence officer who began by gloating in English. Your people obviously did not know what a hefty thing that lock gate is. It was really useless trying to smash it with a flimsy destroyer. At that precise moment, Saint-Nazaire was hit by an explosion described by the town's assistant mayor as an explosion of unbelievable magnitude. Beatty, once his ears had stopped ringing, replied, "That, I hope, is proof that we did not underestimate the strength of the gate." Campbelltown had done her job. The damage was so severe that the dock wasn't just out of action for the rest of the war, it was out of action until 1947. The ship's bell from HMS Campbelltown still survives. I have no idea how. Presumably they dug it out of a garden several miles away where it had just smashed somebody's back garden shed. It was presented to the town of Campbelltown in Pennsylvania at the end of the war, and it was loaned from them to the broadsword-class frigate HMS Campbelltown in 1988 and then returned in 2011 when the Campbelltown was decommissioned. And that just about covers the story of HMS Campbelltown. I really hope.
Okay, well, we are looking at the DD-661. No more pleasing hull form, perhaps, than that of the Fletcher-class destroyer. The U.S. Prodigiously produced tin can during World War II. 175 hulls turned out to serve with distinction in both oceans, in all campaigns, in all capacities, ASW, anti-aircraft, anti-surface. And the Kidd was commissioned in honor of Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd Sr., the captain of the battleship USS Arizona, killed during the Pearl Harbor attack, poignantly commissioned in his memory. And the ship went on to serve all across the Pacific in World War II. Built at Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, Kearney, New Jersey. She was one of 4 destroyers launched on February 28, 1943, in a record-breaking 14 minutes. Her first voyage was of some notoriety under command of Commander Alan B. Roby. The destroyer moved across New York Harbor for delivery to Brooklyn Naval Shipyards, flying the skull and bones of the Jolly Roger high from the foremast. The edition of Time magazine that week carried a photo of Kidd announcing that it had been 100 years since Jolly Roger had flown in New York Harbor. The crew quickly adopted the pirate Captain Kidd, who ironically hailed from New York, as their mascot, which I hope that's not to the insult of the great Captain Kidd from the Arizona, that the pirate identity supplanted him in this way. But the Kidd was on her way to an illustrious career in the Pacific. She served in the Tarawa campaign, bombarding Japanese shore batteries and escorting U.S. amphibious shipping to the beach. Yes, and eventually she was escorting battleships and carriers on their Atlantic shakedown cruises until she entered the Pacific to participate in the Tarawa campaign, then on to the Marshall's campaign, and all the way through the Marianas, serving frenetically with task force assignments in the Southwest Pacific as well, supporting the invasion of Aitape and Uochti and Hollandia, New Guinea. Finally returning to support the Saipan landings, the bombardment of Guam, and on into the Western Pacific with Spruance's Task Force 58. So the ship had an illustrious battle history, which culminated with her service in the Western Pacific off Okinawa, where she, in spite of her refit, where her 21-inch torpedo tubes were removed in favor of additional Bofors 40mm mounts for anti-aircraft fire support. She was eventually hit by a kamikaze, which killed 30 members of her crew and injured 50 more. So grievous losses to kamikaze attack off Okinawa, which was the fate of all too many picket destroyers in that stage of the Pacific War. Today, the Kidd stands as a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. If you ever have the opportunity to visit, as I did, it's a poignant way to really feel what I've written naval history. I've never served in the Navy, unlike Jingles, but to me, these museum ships have been essential to visit and really get a sense of the physicality of naval service, the size of the turrets, the mere size of the beam of a Fletcher-class destroyer. 5 or 7 good strides and you're across that deck, and so you can imagine then what it might be like to be hit by an aerial bomb or a kamikaze or an 8-inch or a 14-inch Japanese battery. Devastating. And these are very well curated ships. They have historical tours. I highly recommend visiting Baton Rouge if you have that opportunity to tour Kidd, or to go and wearing the hat for Patriots Point in Charleston, South Carolina. You can see USS Laffey, USS Yorktown, the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer Laffey. So a shout out today in the age of coronavirus to those who are turning out to maintain these museum ships, keep them well maintained for tourism and visitors like us, to really understand what it meant to serve in the Navy several generations ago on these steam-driven ships, which were so important to the outcome of the war. So let's remember the Fletcher-class destroyer, 175 built during the war. They served so well, and the Kidd was emblematic of this class of ship for her manner and extent of her service all across the Pacific, in all campaigns and in all capacities. In the game itself, playing World of Warships, I tend to operate cruisers and battleships. I always hate to see a Fletcher coming at me. That torpedo battery just has a way of getting in there and busting you, no matter how much health you've got left. And although they're fragile ships, if I can open up on a Fletcher with my secondary on my Massachusetts, it's not going to last long. But if that Fletcher gets in close, I'm done. So it's a fast, capable ship, and they were very adept at doing what destroyers are meant to do, which was to go into harm's way, and they did it everywhere and well. So the Kidd is the exemplar for that long-remembered class, and may they be long remembered and celebrated for what they contributed to victory for the Allied cause in World War II.
Hey, Jim, I'll step in right quick. Kidd is also was used for the filming of the Tom Hanks movie Greyhound, no?
I believe that's true. These museum ships are wonderful for their availability for film production, and there's no replicating a lot of those scenes with CGI. When you can. I haven't seen the film yet. Have you?
Negative. I don't think it's out yet.
Oh. Well, I can't wait to see it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought there was a video to come. So the Project 7s, I've been tasked with that, and a very, very pretty ship. You won't find very many of them modeled at all. This one's by Convoy. And the reason it is so pretty is that it's actually not really a Russian design. So the Russians had shown in the 1910s that they could build a world-class destroyer with the Novix. And so they continued onwards in the Soviet era. They tried off with the Leningrads, the destroyer escorts, the destroyer leaders. Very, very fast ships, but the program as a manufacturing system was a complete disaster. So they decided to try to see what other countries were doing again when they were coming up with this new ship class, the Project 7s. And they were interested particularly in French and Italian designs. And if you look at the lines of this ship, she's basically a Folgore-class Italian destroyer. And obviously it had to be modified a little bit for Soviet service. But the first thing that will come to mind is that the Italian destroyers were designed for operation in the Mediterranean. And a lot of the waters around Russia are not the same as Mediterranean. So some modifications had to be made to the design. They reduced the spacing in the frames, for example, But fundamentally, she has both longitudinal and cross framing, which means that you have weak points where you go from one type of framing to the other. And this wasn't so much of a problem in the Mediterranean, it was definitely a problem up in the Arctic. And at least one ship did lose her bow. Didn't sink, but did lose her bow. Also, when they were designing the ship, there was a bit of debate. Do we want to make this a single engine room, boiler room, or do you want to split it up, engine room, boiler room, split them out for redundancy? The conclusion was that they wanted to go with the shorter space-saving version of having all the boilers together, all three of them, and then all the turbines together. Unfortunately, in 1937, HMS Hunter was sunk, and the word of this reached Stalin, who decided that he would dictate that future versions of the ship would have the split engineering. That gives you to the Project 7U, the improved Project 7s, which have that lengthened system. And unfortunately, it also completely ate into the bunkerage. I mentioned earlier in the stream how the bunkerage on these ships was not what it needed to be. Unfortunately, such was the case. So the Gremyashi is sometimes considered to be the class leader. She was actually the Gvenny class, but she was built first. There were 7 of them built in Leningrad at the same time. Entered service 1938, fairly quickly moved from the Baltic to the North Sea, partook in the convoys. Her only engagement to note was in PQ13, where she attacked a U-boat. PQ13 was an interesting convoy as well, with destroyer clashes and so on, but she only picked it up partway through the convoy. She saw the rest of the war mainly doing shelling, gunfire support, things like that. Now the guns, the 130s were excellent guns. They also came with, and I had to look it up, a diving projectile. Now, unlike the typical round of 800 meters per second, this thing only fired at under 300 meters per second, had a range of about 3 kilometers. And its purpose was when it hit the water, it would dive. And it was designed to be used against submarines. And this is slightly different from the Japanese shells that were designed to turn horizontal when they hit the water. I found that to be an interesting fact, which I'm now passing on to you. When they entered service, they had basic hydrophones, which were useless at over 3 knots, so not much use for ASW, and they did not have radars. It wasn't until Lend-Lease started kicking in that you start seeing, I think it was the Type 286 mic, was the radar that was eventually fitted to Gremyashi. And Aztec was eventually added as well to give it some ASW capabilities. Just to say that, we go to an underwater shot. I have come to a pause. What else was I going to talk about this show? Weapons. So it started out, the torpedoes were Italian designed as well, the 53-36s, I think they are, 38s. Those are Italian designed torpedoes basically from 1932. Weapons could include, they initially started with a modified 45mm anti-tank gun for anti-aircraft purposes, quickly changed to the 37mm automatics. Gremyashi herself would be found eventually with Browning caliber 50 twin mounts, together with, serving side by side, the Dushkas that they came equipped with as well. Anyway, as I say, Project 7, beautiful ships. Four of them, as I recall, were sent on to the People's Liberation Army Navy of China, where they continued to see service. Gremyashi herself was used in nuclear tests and eventually sent in for scrap. And just the 2 ships accompanying her, also Soviet warships. One is the, formerly known as Gangut battleship, with the post-modernized, uniquely raked correction funnel. And Krasny Krim, the Red Crimea, was a Svetlana-class cruiser. And you'll see her also in the background there passing by. So I have nothing else to say about the Project 7s off the top of my head, unless you have any questions, lads. And so, okay, let's move on to a video instead then.
Okay, so this is HMS Haida. Haida is now the only surviving member of the tribal class of destroyers, and she would serve with the Royal Canadian Navy in both the Second World War and the Korean War. Now, Haida is actually a descendant, along with the other tribals, of a rather interesting design, Design V. Design V was put together for the Royal Navy, not as a destroyer, but actually as a very small cruiser. The initial concept that they came up with had 5 twin 4.7-inch gun mounts, with 3 of them stacking up in superfiring positions forward and 2 aft. And if that sounds familiar, then you are fairly quick on the uptake, because that design would actually develop from Design V as well, that being the Dido class. However, it was felt that a 4.7-inch armed cruiser was probably a little bit too small, and so this is where the design heritage diverged. You had the one branch of the design went off and formed, as I said, the Dido class with a 5.25-inch in the originally envisaged armament layout, and the other one, which was now known as V Leader, would become a prototype design for the tribal class. At this point, the tribal still had the 10 4.7-inch guns with 1 turret between the 2 funnels in cube position, but when this was presented to the various heads of service in the Royal Navy, the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet and the China stations were both very much in favor of this vessel, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet was not so much in favor of this vessel, and so the design was revised down again, especially keeping in mind now that it was a destroyer, it had to comply with treaty requirements, to what would eventually become the tribal with 4 twin 4.7-inch guns. Now, at the time, the 4.7-inch guns could only elevate, officially at least, barring a few bits of ingenious work by the crews, to about 40 degrees. But this was thought of as fine at that point, because it was thought that the tribals would be running escort for much larger ships, and surely if a fleet was going to come under attack from the air, it would be the big ships, the carriers, the battleships, and even the heavy cruisers that would be the primary targets. And so the ability for the 4.7-inch gun to elevate much past this wasn't considered particularly vital, because they'd be shooting at targets that were somewhere over there and not coming straight for them. Wartime experience, however, both with the lack of massive fleets sailing around to escort and the tribals having to operate on their own practically under some quite heavy air attack, meant that this was revised. And so by the time that Haida was laid down in September 1941, she was actually taking into account a lot of the early war lessons that the Royal Navy and other tribal class had inherited. And so there are a few changes to her design compared to the baseline tribal. She was a foot wider, and the hull was stiffened because the first few tribals had been put through quite a lot of stress by their crews, who tended to be highly aggressive. She also had a few adaptations for Canadian service, including an auxiliary boiler to provide more heat to the living and machinery spaces. And she had additional searchlights, and most visibly, there was a change of X-turret, that's the rear superfiring position, which was switched from a twin 4.7-inch gun to a twin 4.5-inch weapon, and also twin 4-inch or 4.5-inch. Let me just check my notes. Anyway, that was a high-angle anti-aircraft gun, and that was to enable it to better defend itself in case of direct air attack on the ship itself. There was a scattering of light anti-aircraft weapons, mostly Orlikans, and of course it had a single set of torpedo launchers amidships. Now, that was the twin 4-inch high-angle mount, just in case you're wondering. A few 40mm were thrown in as well. Now, the tribal class were fairly quick, able to achieve, well, no one's entirely sure. Some people have cited the tribals as being able to achieve 36 to 37 knots maximum speed. Others, based on visual evidence and hydrodynamic modelling, appear to have gotten even faster than that, but their official in-service limit was 32 knots. She then joined the Home Fleet and would first see action escorting Arctic convoys to and from Russia, as the Royal Canadian Navy was, of course, fully stuck into the war effort. And In this role, she actually came very close to being involved with the Battle of the North Cape, as she was escorting JW55B, the convoy, when Scharnhorst showed up. But she was part of the close escort of the convoy, and so it was the more distant escort group with the cruisers Norfolk, Belfast, and Sheffield that would initially see off the Scharnhorst, and of course the heavy covering group with Duke of York, Jamaica, and other destroyers that would participate in finally taking the German battleship down. But that wasn't the high point of Haida's career in World War II. She was then assigned to the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, based in the UK, and would take part in numerous sweeps throughout the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel in company with other tribal destroyers, and ironically enough, a couple of Dido-class cruisers, and would be involved alongside them and some of her Canadian sister ships, such as the Athabascan, in numerous encounters with German destroyers, German submarines, and German torpedo boats. And whilst Athabascan would be lost, Haida would come out with quite the notable string of victories to her name. After the Second World War, she would be refitted again with 4-inch and 3-inch gun mounts and sent out to Korea. And in the Korean War, although she wouldn't see quite the same level of surface action, she would join the Trainbusters Club as part of her shore bombardment duties, and would then wind up in the Atlantic again at the end of the Korean War on anti-submarine duties. But given the amount of action she'd seen in World War II, her hull and her engines were quite stressed, and due to these age and wear-related issues, she would be decommissioned in 1963 and listed for scrapping. But she would be saved for preservation, and she can now be visited in Hamilton in Ontario, Canada, to this day. Well, at least once lockdown's over. Okay, and now it's time to have a little bit of a look at a video that includes some of those views of Haida.
Right, so we're going to go from the fightingest ship of the Canadian Navy to the fightingest ship of the Polish Navy. And if World War II was anything to go by, you really don't want to make Polish people angry, because they let you know about it very violently. And the operational history of Błyskawica is pretty much a case in point. And I'll also just mention, last comment on Haida as well, is she's twinned. Like cities are twinned, well, she is twinned with Błyskawica. So they have that relationship continues to ongoing. The reason that they're twinned is they're operational together as well in 10th Flotilla. So Błyskawica started off as the second of a 2-ship class. The other one was Grom. So the one that's called Lightning is Błyskawica. Grom was Thunder. And of note, Gremyashi also means thunderous, and we'll be coming back to that in a little bit. Started off in the mid-1930s. The Polish were trying to get new destroyers, and they tried France, and it didn't work out too well. They tried Sweden, that didn't work out too well. And so they ended up talking to the UK. And the UK, by this point, especially with tribals coming along as well, are definitely well known for making good ships. So they go to the British, they ask for mainly foreign armaments. So she's very heavily armed with 7 120mm Bofors guns, as well as torpedoes and the smaller caliber stuff as well. And she was also fast, coming up at some 39 knots. Now, of course, she's built to fight, and as soon as it looked like the Germans were going to invade, she ran away. which was a very sensible thing to do, all things considered. And this meant that she was able to cause the Germans complete hell for the next several years, starting off with Dunkirk, for example. So she was there covering the escorts. She's basically everywhere. She ran convoy escorts. So, for example, the PQ-13 that I mentioned earlier that Gremiaschi had attacked the U-boat, Liskovitsa was one of the escorts to take the convoy up to Iceland. But, of course, the Swedish weapon was not in Royal Navy service. So in order to, given how much they were shooting, they needed new ammo. They basically decided, let's put British guns on this ship instead. They took the Swedish 120s off. They put British 4-inchers on. And with all the ammunition in the world, they're now basically effectively part of the Royal Navy operationally, together with the Canadians and everybody else that's up there. They continue to cause havoc and mayhem. She attacks U-boats. She shoots down airplanes. She is the sole defender of the Isle of Wight town of Cowes during an attack. Cowes, I'm sure Jingles will correct me. And basically, there's 160 bombers show up, and all you got shooting back of any great note is Liskovitsa, and also pumping smoke as well to obscure the German targets. So as I said, she ends up working with Haida in the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, takes part in the Battle of Ushant, where there's engagement with German destroyers. And the two ships have basically been friends ever since. And of course, she is a survivor. She is sitting now quayside in Poland, where you can go visit her if you ever want, as well as playing it in the game. I'll just make mention also, she's accompanied in this convoy by two other fairly famous ships, HMS Exeter and HMS Cossack. Exeter, of course, Battle of the River Plate, engaged Graf Spee, took extremely heavy damage. Unfortunately, did not survive the war, ended up being attacked by Japanese and sunk by, if I recall, torpedoes. And HMS Cossack in the back is famous for the last hostile boarding action, at least that I can think of, where she went up against Altmark, which granted wasn't a warship, but was still enemy held and apparently did offer resistance. And the purpose of that was to rescue the crews that had been captured by the German raider Graf Spee, which had been engaged by Exeter, who was in front of her in the line of convoy. So I don't know if that was a deliberate sequencing by the organizers of the parade or not, but that's a nice little touch. So I open it up to any questions or other commentary, like how do you pronounce cows or cows?
You had it right the first time. It is Cows. There's actually I can't pronounce the name of the captain of the Liskovitsa at the time, but there's a square in the town that was named after him in recognition of what his ship did for the defense of the town in World War II. Not that I've been there.
I think I've flown over it.
Yeah.
In a Spitfire of all things.
Oh wow!
So it's the snazziest thing in my logbook. Is I got like Cessna 172, 7 then Spitfire. But anyway, so as I say, Liskovitsa is available for visiting. I do hope to get there. I haven't gone to her yet. Has anybody else? No?
She was on my list of ships to visit in Europe before the current situation developed. So hopefully once that's all done and dusted, I will be going and visiting her.
I haven't visited her, but I do have a confession to make. Jim, I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. But when I was a callow youth, I was actually in Baton Rouge, and I never visited the kid. Oh. Didn't even know it was there. I'm so sorry.
Well, in fairness, half the ships in Portsmouth I haven't been on. I mean, Victory, yes. But some of the other ships that they have there I haven't.
Warrior is well worth a visit. It's incredibly well preserved.
It's, they're government funded though. So a lot of the museum ships in the US are not government funded, and it's not cheap, especially given we got some
volunteer labor and funding for sure. Yeah, they're labors of love in most cases.
Well, you can get a ticket for the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard that includes all the sites, and the ticket's good for a year, so you can keep coming back. If you missed anything, if you didn't have the time to see everything, keep the ticket.
It's a little bit of a drive from Texas.
Yeah. And just to go back to the point you were making right at the beginning, Chieftain, the when the Polish Navy, that of it that managed to get over to the UK in time, had to be sort of farmed out to various formations of the Royal Navy to work alongside, the Royal Navy checklist basically went, right, we have some very, very angry, very, very skillful men. Who should we pair them with? So who are our most aggressive men? Well, those will be the destroyer captains. Right, who's the maddest and most aggressive of the lot? Well, as naval historian Dr. Alexander Clark will tell you, that would be the tribal class destroyers. And so the Polish ships such as Błyskawice and Piorun were all sent to operate with tribal class flotillas, where they definitely pulled their weight. Of course, there is the famous story of Piorun flashing "I am a Pole" by signal light at Bismarck in the middle of a night engagement, because not only were they happy to sling 4.7-inch and 4.5-inch shells at people, but they also wanted them to know exactly who was sending them way.
I seem to recall, I might have this wrong, but I seem to recall there was one ship that flew under 3 battle flags at the same time. It was French, Polish, and British, if I recall. It was an escaped French ship that the Royal Navy took into service, and they gave it a Polish crew.
Yeah, I remember something vaguely about that. I can't remember off the top of my head which ship it was. But
I'm going to have to look that up now. That sounds intriguing.
But there's a reason Błyskawice was off of the Isle of Wight, and that's because effectively most of the Polish crews, if they had any choice at all as to where they were going to be assigned, they wanted to get in on the closest and most vicious action they could find. Yeah. And the English Channel was about as close as you could get to German-held Europe at the time. Okay,
I think we're going to move on to a video now, some of the Błyskawice footage. We've got Naval Legends videos on lots of ships now. It's wonderful. I'm not quite sure if that's this second or not, if we're going ahead and here.
Howdy folks, welcome back, or perhaps you should be welcoming me back. There she is, the Warspite. Isn't she beautiful? Of course, as you all know, HMS Warspite was a Queen Elizabeth class battleship of the Royal Navy, launched on the 26th of November 1913 and commissioned on the 8th of March 1915. She was assigned to the Grand Fleet and saw her first action at the Battle of Jutland, or, you know, if you're from around there, Jutland, in 1916. Unfortunately, the battle was less than decisive for either side, and Warspite in particular suffered heavy damage. While the 5th Battle Squadron, of which Warspite and their sister ships were part, were trailing Admiral Beatty's battlecruiser squadron, German ships were sighted. The battlecruiser squadron immediately turned to engage, but due to a signalling error, Warspite's 5th Battle Squadron continued steaming east, eventually putting them 10 miles away from the battlecruisers, far out of range of any protection offered by their 15-inch guns, which had twice the hitting power of the 12-inch guns on the German battlecruisers and battleships. HMS Indefatigable blew up after being hit by the Von der Tann with just 2 survivors. It took 20 minutes for the Warspite to get into range, and she finally opened fire on the leading German battlecruisers at a range of 23,000 yards, scoring their first hits on the Von der Tann. For the British battlecruisers, however, the Warspite and her sisters were still too far away to deter the German fleet, and HMS Queen Mary was destroyed with just 17 survivors. BT finally decided enough was enough and it was time to get out of there, but again, signalling failures caused confusion, with BT ships blocking the fire from the Queen Elizabeths as they sailed between them and the German High Seas Fleet. At this point, Warspite's 5th Battle Squadron was split in its fire between both Hipper's battle cruisers and Scheer's battleships, causing significant damage in particular to the battle cruisers. But during a turn executed to allow the squadron to sail north to rejoin the Grand Fleet, Warspite was hit and her rudder was jammed. This happened at about the same time that 3 British cruisers, HMS Defence, Warrior and Black Prince, had decided to close in and finish off the badly damaged German cruiser Wiesbaden, or possibly Wiesbaden, I'm not entirely sure, only to arrive at precisely the same time as Scheer's battleships appeared on the horizon. HMS Defence was sunk, Warrior and Black Prince were mauled, needing a miracle to survive suffering the same fate as HMS Defence. The surviving crew of the Warrior looked on in amazement as Warspite steamed in, circling around the battered cruisers and taking the bulk of enemy fire for them. This was not deliberate, however, as the crew of the Warrior believed, but because Warspite's rudder had been jammed, leaving her sailing in circles right in front of the entire German high seas fleet. The Warspite took such a beating before steering control was regained that at one point Commander Walwyn, below decks, coordinating damage control, said, "At this time I thought our 6-inch secondaries were firing, but I realised afterwards it was only hits on us. The noise was deafening and rather nerve-shattering. You could not hear yourself speak and had to shout in anybody's ear." The Warspite was saved by the rest of the Grand Fleet finally turning up, forcing Scheer's ships to retreat, but she'd suffered extremely heavy damage and was forced to return to Rosyth in Scotland for repairs, almost being sunk by the U-boat U-63 on the way back, but chasing it off by attempting to ram it. That would pretty much be it for the Grand Old Lady of Jutland for the rest of World War I, but following her refit in 1937, she was in fine shape to take part in several notable actions in World War II, beginning with the naval battle of Narvik in Norway, where she led a force of destroyers into the Norwegian fjords to finish off the German destroyer force trapped in there. To players of World of Warships, it might seem suicidal in the extreme to take a battleship into narrow fjords to fight destroyers that could be lurking around any corner ready to launch torpedoes. But the Grand Old Lady had a couple of tricks up her sleeve. First, her 15-inch shells had been reset with 0 delay fuses, so they'd explode on impact and not overpenetrate destroyer armour. And she had a pair of Fairy Swordfish spotter planes, although later in the war she swapped them out for Supermarine Walrus flying boats. But these spotter planes could direct the fire of the guns onto any German ships lurking in ambush around a corner before they even knew they were in a fight. One of these Swordfish also achieved the distinction of being the first aircraft ever to sink a submarine by dropping 250-pound bombs on the U-64 and sinking it. You could question the stupidity of employing submarines in the narrow and shallow waters of the fjords, but that argument had already been fought and lost by Admiral Dönitz, and the crews of his U-boats were now paying the price. The value of the spotting provided by the Swordfish was proven when the Z-13 class destroyer Erich Kölner tried to ambush Warspite with torpedoes as she sailed around a corner in the fjord. Arthur White, a gunner on board the tribal class destroyer HMS Eskimo, witnessed what happened. He said, "There was a rushing sound, like a bloomin' express train. Put the fear of Christ in us. We wondered what the hell it was. All of a sudden, this destroyer and the cliff behind it just blew up." Able seaman Banks in Warspite's A turret recalled, "Warspite had immediately turned to starboard, suspecting the enemy's intention would be to torpedo us as we passed. As we did so, we saw the enemy torpedo tracks, but due to us turning towards them and presenting a much smaller target, pay attention here, World of Warships players, there's something you can learn from this, they missed. In the next few seconds, all hell was let loose. Both A and B turrets fired, and we couldn't miss from that range. Imagine, if you can, 4 15-inch shells, each weighing a ton, with 0 delay fuses packed with high explosive, each hitting a thin-skinned destroyer. The Kölner did not survive. Neither did any of the other 7 German destroyers trapped at Narvik, which represented almost a third of the German Navy's entire destroyer force. Later that year at Calabria, under the command of Admiral Andrew Brown Cunningham, Warspite scored the longest-range gunnery hits from a moving ship onto a moving target in history, scoring a hit on the Giulio Cesare at a range of 24 kilometres, a record that was equalled by the Scharnhorst, but which has never been beaten. During the Battle of Matapan, Warspite again entered the history books when guided by radar and closing in undetected on the Italian fleet at night. She and her sister ships Valiant and Barham closed to within 3,000 yards, point-blank range, minimal elevation on the guns, before illuminating the heavy cruisers Fiume and Zara and obliterating them, along with some of their destroyer escorts. Matapan was arguably the most one-sided naval battle in history, with the Italian Navy suffering 1 battleship damaged, 3 heavy cruisers and 1 destroyer sunk, with a further 1 destroyer heavily damaged and over 2,300 men killed, all for the loss of 1 Swordfish shot down, 3 light cruisers slightly damaged, with a total of 3 men killed. Warspite would see further service throughout the war, most notably in the evacuation of Crete and further operations in the Mediterranean, including Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the assault and invasion of Italy across the Straits of Messina, the landings at Salerno, and achieved the distinction on D-Day of being the first ship to open fire to cover the Allied landings. After the war, time had taken its toll on the old girl, and on the 19th of April 1947, she departed Portsmouth to be scrapped at Faslane in Scotland. The grand old lady of Jutland, however, was having none of this, and during a storm she slipped her tow lines and ran herself aground, rather than face the ignoble fate of being scrapped. One of the 15-inch barrel plugs and her chapel door can still be seen at the Royal Navy Museum in Portsmouth in the historic dockyard, and her ship's wheel can be seen on display in the City Hall of Narvik, which I think is entirely inappropriate for the grand old lady. And I believe that's about all I have on the Warspite. It's been a pleasure to talk about my favourite ship, not just in World of Warships, but like ever. So I believe next we're going to be going back to the amazing Mr. James Hornfisher, where he's going to be talking about Big Manny, the USS Massachusetts.
My pleasure. The pride of Fall River, Massachusetts. You so fondly remembered your favorite ship, Warspite. I will try to do my turn with the shining star of my home state, Massachusetts. If you're ever there, you owe it to yourself to go down to Fall River to Battleship Cove, where this is one of the most lovingly restored and maintained museum ships in the country. I suppose if you're a connoisseur of fast battleship museum ships, you can visit Alabama, down along I-10 in Alabama, or you can come north and visit Big Mamie, where she's okay. Sorry. So you know, we're talking about the third of the 4 South Dakota class fast battleships. Familiar to World of Warships players for her fast firing secondary battery. If you spec out a captain with manual secondaries and buy the Massachusetts, you're in for a real treat. You'll hold down that command key, select any ship within 11.3 kilometers, and watch the fire rain. I love drawing an opposing battleship into a 1v1 if I can kite away and lure them within secondary's range. The DPM just mounts as the fires start, and those beautiful 5-inch 38s just shower down, starting fires, and it's almost an invincible ship in a 1v1. If you can draw an opponent within secondary's range, your DPM is going to burn them down, and then the 16 inches will do the rest. Great fun to play. I recommend Massachusetts very highly in World of Warships. She wasn't so bad in real life either. She's the ship that put the fire into Operation Torch in November 1942, squaring off Casablanca with the partially completed French battleship Jean Bart. Sort of a mismatch there. Jean Bart only had one operational turret, a Quad 15, and Massachusetts quickly put her out of action, disabling that turret and proceeding to tear apart the waterfront there at Casablanca, taking apart the waterfront warehouses and dry docks. We're doing a pretty fair job of preparing the way for the invasion force. So thereafter, you know, Massachusetts was redeployed to the Pacific, where she served ably with the fast carrier task forces, supporting operations in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and then on to westward, as they say. So these ships were very well suited to supporting carriers. They were reasonably fast, although carrier task force commanders preferred to have light cruisers in their screen because they were so much faster in keeping station under air attack. But these big battleships they were loaded with 40 millimeter Bofors and 20s, and their big 5-inch 38 broadsides could throw up a lot of VT fused flak to tear apart kamikazes. Massachusetts served ably all the way through, and then finally reprised her role off Casablanca, if you will, off the Kameishi yards, bombarding Japanese steelworks at Kameishi, and preparing the way for the invasion of Japan that never had to come off. But a beautiful ship. These fast battleships were, you know, featured the familiar triple turret centerline configuration of 16-inch 45s, which were more than a match for just about anything the Japanese had. Massachusetts never had her chance in a surface action, but she did show her potential a number of times. And again, if you have the opportunity to go to Fall River and can take the opportunity to see the ship up in person, you'll be impressed by her clean lines, somewhat cramped quarters. They weren't very popular with their crews, especially once they were refitted with all these 40s. during the late war that boosted their crew complements and their jam-cramped ships. But they were more than capable in almost any combat scenario, and at 45,000 tons fully loaded, could hold their own with just about anything the Japanese might have chosen to send at them. So let's hear it for these well-used ships. The 4 South Dakotas, the 2 North Carolinas, and the 4 Iowas were the backbone of the U.S. fleet during the war, and are impressive to visit to this day. There are so many of them well preserved. All the different Iowas are available, of course, and now we have 2 South Dakotas, the Alabama and the Massachusetts. I highly recommend you visit if you have a chance to go to Fall River, Mass.
It doesn't hurt that they're extremely easy on the eye as well, aren't they? I mean, those are good-looking ships.
Oh, for sure. Very nice hull form and nice proportions.
There's an old engineering saying, if it looks right, it is right.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
The big question is, could she take on Bismarck?
I think I'd pit 16-inch 45 AP against any ship in the world.
Oh, yeah. I'd put my money on the Massachusetts.
Not to say a lucky hit wouldn't change the day. I mean, again, it comes down to a crew knows how to use their fire control equipment, their microwave radars, their computers, their good stable gyros, and got to make sure your turrets are aligned, of course. All those things in place. Yeah, I like the chances of any South Dakota against the Bismarck.
Oh, hell yeah.
And of course, there is also the honour that Massachusetts has of not actually losing a man to enemy action during the entirety of World War II, which, due to my interest in preserving my own skin, means that if should I ever get sent back in time to World War II, guess which ship I'm signing up to serve on.
That's a good point, because that's a question.
How many were killed by accident?
Unknown, but I'd hope I'm sensible enough not to fall down several flights of stairs.
Well, no, I mean, there was one American battleship, a secondary mount fired into another secondary mount. Was that Alabama?
I don't know, but that's a design flaw. It shouldn't be possible. They should have stops that would prevent it from traversing far enough to actually hit itself.
There were any number of casualties suffered during the Marianas Turkey shoot as the Japanese are attacking Task Force 58. You can imagine how much AA is flying up from these 5-inch 38 mounts.
Oh, yeah.
You know, radar detonated VT fuses blowing up at, by radar detonation, flinging shrapnel down over the entirety of the carrier task force. There were men on destroyers who were killed and injured. Dozens of men.
I read somewhere, and it might have been one of your books, actually, Jim, about the sheer tonnage of metal that could be put into the air by something like an Iowa or a South Dakota-class battleship when all of its anti-aircraft guns opened up at once. It was just staggering. It was like 50 tons a minute of metal. It was
between all those VT shells and the F-6F, combat air patrol, the poor Japanese didn't stand a chance attacking Task Force 58. And it would have been terrifying.
A number 9 5-inch turret fired into the number 5 mount. Killed 5, wounded 11.
Well, it could have been worse. At least no one was killed. Although, speaking of the kamikazes, I do have a question that's puzzled me for years. Why do kamikaze pilots wear crash helmets? I don't know. It just indicates a certain lack of commitment, if you know what I'm saying.
Well, if a little piece of fragmentation comes at them before they hit the ship, they want to make sure that they stay awake.
Oh, I see. That must be it then. Okay.
Oh, well, I think I know that we've visited Massachusetts with a camera crew, so I'm sure that the devs have, or the stream commanders have a video to show us of Big Mammy.
And now it's time to look at something completely different. This is the French battleship Richelieu. Now, the Richelieu class, which comprised of 2 ships as completed, Richelieu and Jean Bart, remain the largest French-built warships of any kind, as they actually ended up displacing even more than the modern nuclear aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle. Its origins go all the way back to the 1930s, when the Germans were building the Deutschland class, of all things. This had prompted the French to build the 2 Dunkirk class, and the Italians then started building the Littorio class. The Germans started on the Scharnhorsts, and this escalated up to the French response, which was to start designing their first battleship that would actually hit the water since the Britannias at the start of World War I, and this would of course be Richelieu. Initially, the French were actually looking at a number of possible options for their guns and turrets. They were considering 15-inch guns or 16-inch guns, and they're also looking at 2 different layouts: the forward quad turrets or 3 triples, somewhat like the older British battleship Nelson. But on the 35,000-ton displacement limit that they were having to work to, they decided it was impossible to fit a quad 16-inch turret. It would just be too big and too heavy. And the triple 16-inch option, which was physically viable on the whole, was still too heavy if they wanted the ships to actually have battleship-grade armor protection. And so it was over to the 15-inch designs. These were then taken into a number of sub-variants. There were some very odd ones at this stage, including one that had a pair of quad turrets mounted back-to-back behind the bridge superstructure, with the only guns forward of the bridge being a couple of twin mounts for the secondary battery. But they rapidly found that with the desired top speed, which was quite high, the 3-turret arrangement took up far too much room in the hull, and they needed that space for the machinery, and so the design options dropped back to what had ironically actually been the very first presented plan, which was essentially to take Dunkirk and run it through the photocopier with the scale setting set up to 35,000 tons. Now, the French had done extensive work on quadruple turrets for 2 classes of battleship that actually ended up being cancelled during the First World War, the Normandie and Lyon classes. And because of the risk that with so many guns in a single turret, a ship might lose a substantial portion of its main armament to just one hit, each turret was actually divided down the middle by a fairly substantial bulkhead. So they were actually, in some ways, a pair of twin turrets that just happened to be in very close formation. And you can see that on the battleship, where you'll notice that although it's a quad turret, unlike, say, the King George V's, the turret guns are laid out in 2 close pairs. Therefore, the ships would be armed with a total of 8 15-inch guns in the aforementioned quadruple turrets located forward of the bridge, which was somewhat more sensible, with one super firing above the other. The secondary battery, however, was upgraded, as it was felt that on a full-on battleship, the 130mm gun on the Dunkirks wasn't quite powerful enough. And so these were replaced with initially 5 triple 152mm turrets. Now, Richelieu in game and in reality only ended up with 3, but that was because at the very last moment, the planned twin automatic 37mm light anti-aircraft mounts that they'd wanted to put in weren't actually ready. And so they deleted the 2 amidships 152mm turrets in favor of installing quite a number of 100mm guns in twin mounts, which would leave the secondary battery on launch as 9 of the 6.1-inch guns in the 3 triple turrets at the back there, 1 on each side and 1 amidships, and thus giving a broadside of 6 guns for the secondary battery on either side. There were supposed to be a number of 37mm and 13.2mm guns for light AA as well, but getting these proved somewhat difficult whilst the war was ongoing. We can also see Richelieu here passing under the bridge. There is a rather famous photo historically of Richelieu entering New York Harbor, and they had to lower part of the main mast to fit her through. Unfortunately, in game, she doesn't have a retractable mast, so you're just going to have to pretend that the mast hasn't just clipped through the bridge and demolished several vehicles. The Richelieus were pretty quick. They were capable of 30 knots, and they had a 13-inch thick sloped belt along with 6 inches of deck armor. and a backup deck further down that was somewhat thinner, designed to catch any splinters from shells that detonated on or near the primary deck. In theory, the 6.6-inch guns should have been dual purpose, but that didn't really work out very well. The ship would actually make potentially up to 32 knots, as the power plant turned out to be able to chuck out a lot more power than they'd initially thought it capable of. But Richelieu would end up with a slightly colourful wartime career. She just about made it out of mainland France before the German invasion and was not quite complete, fetching up in the port of Dakar in Senegal. And without much of her anti-aircraft battery, when she came under attack by the British after the Mers El Kabir incident, she proved to be relatively unable to defend herself and actually was sunk in harbour by swordfish torpedo bombers. But due to the shallow nature of the harbour, much like many of the American ships at Pearl Harbor, she was refloated and moved away. She would then engage HMS Barham and HMS Resolution in a gun duel, which was relatively inconclusive. But after the Allied landings in North Africa, when French forces in Africa joined the Allies, she was then sent to the United States for refit and repair, replacing her secondary and anti-aircraft battery, except for those 100mm guns. And in this format, she was sent to join the British Home Fleet in March 1944, transferring to the Pacific, where she would spend the rest of the war attacking Japanese positions alongside the British Pacific Fleet. And she would celebrate the end of the war in September 1945 by hitting a magnetic mine. This, however, didn't impair her combat operations too much, as she took French troops back to Indochina after repairs, and then took part in various training operations before being placed in reserve in 1958 and then taken out of service finally for scrapping in 1968.
So she's a very elegant ship, but she's being accompanied by HMS Nelson behind, also with the funny guns forward configuration. And I don't think Nelson's so elegant. This apparently is a matter of some great debate.
Nelson is beautiful. Change my mind.
Yes, Nelson is very much a Marmite ship. You either love it or hate it. The Royal Navy officers did call Nelson and Rodney Nelsol and Rodol after a series of oil tankers that all ended in the letters OL at the end. But whether that was an affectionate nickname or one said with great distaste really depended on the officer in question. Richelieu, however, I think definitely does pull off the all-forward armament very nicely.
Yeah, she is. Like the Iowas and the South Dakotas, she is very nice to look at.
And I guess we just mentioned Emile Bertin is bringing up the rear there.
Yep, the good old French cruisers there. The interesting thing is the Richelieus were planned to be a 4-ship class, but most French battleship classes in history are subject to endless amounts of tinkering, and the last two, Clemenceau and Gascogne, would have looked quite different to Richelieu and Jean Bart by the time they were finished. But unfortunately, obviously, due to the intervention of war, that wasn't able to happen. It is always one of the endless fun little queries that go around naval historians' heads to think about what would have happened had Mers El Kabir gone, well, better than it did. It's difficult for it to have gone much worse, but if Mers El Kabir had ended in a slightly more palatable way, then it's entirely possible that Richelieu might have entered service with the Allied navies a lot sooner, which of course does render the rather interesting scenario of a Richelieu versus Bismarck fight in 1941, which I'm pretty sure the French crew would have been spoiling for.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm sure they would have been well up for that.
Well, the history of the French forces, though, once the country had capitulated, it's interesting how, as a matter of honor, they defended what territory they had left, such as in North Africa, Syria, and places like that. And so, okay, yeah, we had our asses kicked, but we have this peace treaty, and we are going to continue to enforce it. And we realize that we don't, well, unless you're English, we don't have an issue with you. Which is why in World War II, the torch landings, all the Americans have big, huge flags painted on the sides of their tank and on their arms and so on, to say, "Hey, French people, we are not English. Please don't shoot at us." I'm not sure it didn't work, but it was what it was tried for. And also of note, the flag was as you would view it ordinarily, not with the reversed Union forward thing, which is a 21st century thing. But it was just a matter of honor for the French.
Yeah.
Hmm.
World War II obviously was very, very difficult for France. There's never been an official French history of World War II. Did you know that? They just couldn't agree on what should be written, and that's understandable.
Yeah, it's the it's always the fun part. I mean, it's as Chieftain says, that to be honest, approaching France with big flags that say "We're not English, please don't shoot" would probably work for most of the past 1,000 years of Anglo-French history. But I think when it comes to Richelieu and most of the rest of the Marine Nationale ships that were around at the beginning of World War II in 1940, it does remain one of those great pities that the various negotiations that resulted after the formation of the Vichy French government didn't quite resolve themselves in the way that perhaps they could have or should have, because it did lead to a lot of deaths that in hindsight were unnecessary. Obviously at the time it's a very much different situation. The information we have available to us now, both in terms of documents and in terms of what was actually there, people knew, it was entirely different.
Yeah. I mean, we know now, thanks to the actions of the French Navy at Toulon, that there is no way the French ships at Mers-el-Kébir would ever have been turned over to the Germans. But we didn't know that at Mers-el-Kébir.
Yeah, and it's there were still some ships. It must be said there were still some French Marine Nationale ships that came over to fight in the Free French forces pretty much from day one. But Richelieu unfortunately was not amongst them, and of course Jean Bart never quite complete her sister ship during the Second World War. And eventually, actually, ironically enough, ending up in a fight with our previous vessel, USS Massachusetts, which, to be honest, didn't go too well for her. But then again, she only had half her main armament, was partially covered in concrete and stuck in a dock. So I'm not sure what particular level of handicap you give her for that.
If Massachusetts had lost.
Yes.
It's fairly safe to say she didn't have the mobility advantage.
No.
As I'm just looking at the Twitch stream, I'm just going to give a shout out. I've been kind of keeping it in the background to the various cameramen and the editor. That this really has looked a lot like a fleet passing review. It's been very well done. I don't know if you guys have been following it or not.
Yes. I put it up on my second monitor. I actually took part in the fleet review. First one in the Royal Navy since I think 1962. Not as exciting as they're cracked out to be.
Was that
a lot of polishing, right?
Lots and lots of polishing and ironing of uniforms and standing at attention while the ship sails past as the Queen sort of waves from the deck of whichever aircraft carrier she's on.
Was that the one for the Trafalgar 2005?
That was it, yeah. I was on board this.
Well, there's a slight twist of irony for you, because I was on the shore at Southsea Castle.
Wow.
And then took a very, very extended run all the way back to Portsmouth Station, bypassing pretty much everybody else who was there in order to get the last train back into London.
Smart.
I was in Iraq. It's about as far from the water as you could get.
Yes.
Switch.
Actually, that's a question, Mr. Hornfisher. You might be able to answer this. Obviously there's the Spithead Naval Review and such like, and I know there were a couple of victory parades that the U.S. Navy put on after World War I and World War II. Does the U.S. Navy do fleet reviews and that kind of large ship parading these days?
Yeah, Fleet Week.
Well, they do things like Fleet Week in New York, where they'll have cruisers and destroyers dock, and they have Liberty and sort of a big public celebration of naval service. And so we have Fleet Week, but like things like the Great White Fleet's procession or big naval parades as such, I don't know such things to happen anymore.
Well, the Fleet Week San Francisco does do a parade of ships. So they come under the Golden Gate Bridge before coming into alongside, and then you can go
Let's
visit
remember
them.
USS Constitution also. They'll take her out and turn her around. The oldest commissioned ship in the Navy, old Ironside, still has a place in the active fleet. And they do take her out for an occasional turnaround, which is a big ceremonial thing and a public event.
I have to tell you, if you do manage to be lucky enough to be on board a British warship that gets sent over to New York for Fleet Week, it is the best run ashore in the world. Particularly if you're able to go ashore on what we call a rig run, where you go ashore in your number 1 uniform. Oh my God. You never have to put your hand in your pocket. And I'm sure that's true for US Navy sailors at Fleet Week in New York as well. Everything is paid for you. It's just amazing.
Before they changed the regulations on uniforms, we had our army dress blues with the cav hats, and you hit the Vegas Strip, you're sorted.
Yes.
I will mention one other thing on the San Francisco Fleet Week. A couple of years ago, there was a Russian destroyer, a Slava class, or at least what in Cold War I would call a Slava class. She comes alongside. She opens the gangplanks for about 2 hours. And about 10% of the people that were lined up to get aboard her actually managed to get aboard before the Russians said no. And it was just such a fascinating opportunity to see a Slava-class cruiser sitting in San Francisco.
I can't remember exactly when it was, but we had a couple of Russian ships. I can't remember what they were. I think it might have been a Sovereign. They weren't anything as big as a Slava-class cruiser, but they were berthed just behind us on Fountain Lake Jetty, in the dockyard in Portsmouth. And it was, you kind of felt sorry for them because things weren't going too well back in Russia with Glasnost and, the fall of the Soviet Union and the emergence of democracy again and so on and so on. None of these guys have been paid in 6 months. So, yay, we get to go to Portsmouth, but we can't do anything because we have no money. So we all clubbed together and bought them a load of pizzas. They got like 50 pizzas delivered to their gangway because...
Here's the rapprochement, Admiral Jingles style.
They were a good bunch of guys. They were penniless. It was a real shame.
Actually, speaking of the Great White Fleet and that particular fleet review, I think there'd be a lot of people who'd really, really like to see Great White Fleet camos and Royal Navy late 19th century camos. Yeah. I know my entire British line would be kitted out in Royal Navy black, white, and buff.
Have you seen the special camo the Warspite has for 3
Yes.
Lions? Oh,
yeah.
So nice.
We have those camos actually available for some ships for the British cruisers. Well, they are like the tropical station camos.
Yeah, the Mediterranean fleet
white
camos.
And buff.
Yeah.
There was an American battleship that had a Harlequin dazzle scheme. Was it Nevada, perhaps? It was Jim.
I think I saw the picture. It was a World War I camouflage, right?
Yeah. Bright yellow and red diamonds all along the whole side.
There's a camo for the Dreadnought that looks a lot like that.
Yes.
I think it's the Dreadnought's premium camo.
Yeah, dazzle camo and that sort of thing was all the rage in the First World War.
By the way, you mentioned earlier about the camera work, but I want to stress that this entire review wouldn't be possible without a lot of people actually driving the ships around. And all those people are our volunteer super testers who, apart from their testing duties, took on this opportunity to show off their formation sailing skills.
Yeah, didn't see any collisions at all.
Yeah, they were training for for a week or so.
I know they've been doing it at least since Wednesday last week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, in general, a big shout out to all of our volunteer groups, and in particular to our super testers, who've invested actually a lot of time to arrange this ballet, because you guys can imagine that all of these ships travel at different speed. So in order to have them running through New York and at the same speed, it takes a bit of arrangement, having everything in place. So big shout out to the guys. Thank you very, very much for helping us out with this.
Yeah.
As far as I know, the biggest problem was the USS Texas, which is the slowest.
Yeah, it's like a quarter throttle on the Campbelltown isn't quite the same as a quarter throttle on the Texas, is it?
Oh, man. So actually, I think they deserve a bit of a highlight, so I'll do a quick credit roll. So, sailing with us were Zavkiel Sama, El Fructini, Kismet, who took a big part in organizing everything, Covenanter, Light Baron, another of our coordinators, Obican, Trainspite, Killerbin 34, Mr. Greek, Funsborough, Tiger Tech 74, Old Grandad, Tar Eldarion, Dr. Snuggles, Buzzinga Flux, Isamu Kondera, you might know his mods, Toby Jack, Budstank, Day of Moan, X1 Maverick, Earl of Norfolk, Ecotech, another of our coordinators, Admiral Dude, Kankole Congo, Ataru, Sniping Cat, Fire RM, and Dr. Arcade. Thank you guys, we wouldn't be able to do this without you.
So chat, if you want to clap, just put an F in chat.
Oh dear.
Come on, you have to give me the chance to, ruin chat at least once. And there we go.
Look at what you've started.
By the way, did we have any interesting questions from the chat?
We had a boatload of questions. I actually wrote down a few of them. If you guys want to stick around for a few minutes to answer them.
Yeah, go on.
I got a few minutes.
Okay.
Bring up your file of doom.
Mr. Conway, can you switch to... Okay, it's just because of the sound. So, we had a few questions. So, from YouTube, we had Brendan Wardlow, who said, what happened in the Black Sea during the war? I know both Germans and Soviets were active, but don't know any specifics.
A lot of shelling.
Yes, it was a vicious little place to be if you were in a warship. Obviously, you've got a rather large siege going on, and a lot of Russian destroyers running in and out trying to do supply runs and dodging Luftwaffe left and right. And you've got, for extra fun, Italian midget submarines, and a few U-boats popped up at various points as well. I think the U-boats probably felt rather lost, but the Italian midget submarines were definitely intentional. So, you had to be fast and brave to survive the naval combat in the Black Sea in World War II.
I think how confined the Mediterranean was, and then multiply that by 3, and you've got the Black Sea.
Plus, there were several sieges of major naval bases. There was the siege of Odessa,
Sevastopol.
the siege of Sevastopol, and even kind of, not really siege, but battle for Novorossiysk. So it was kind of busy, especially for the light forces.
Yeah, no thank you. I'll stay on the Massachusetts.
Thank you. Then we had also the question from Tobep17.
If you want to know what it was like, here's a book to read.
What's that?
The Soviets as naval opponents. It's all about the Black Sea. Good book to look at. That's by Friedrich Ruge. He talked all about Gorshkov's boys and how aggressive they were, running resupply runs across the Black Sea and supporting the operations in the Caucasus and all that. And the U.S. Navy read that with interest after the war.
Yeah, I'll bet. Know your enemy.
Absolutely. Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question here because obviously we cannot have World of Warships stream without a question about the Bismarck.
Another one.
Tobeb17 says, if Bismarck had succeeded in getting to port after the battle against Hood, had she been able to leave the harbor in search of merchant ships, or had a bomb shattered her in the harbor? What do you think?
Well, she would have been in for a bit of repairs for quite a while, because even if she managed to get away after the Battle of Denmark Strait, remember, she did have a rather large hole in her front, courtesy of Prince of Wales, and a few other holes in slightly less important places. So she would have had to go into dock for repairs to that. And, well, if you look at how much the Royal Air Force tried to re-landscape the French ports into something more closely resembling the moon, just when Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were in there. If you've got Bismarck there as well, I think the Royal Air Force would have, they put a lot of effort in, they would have redoubled their efforts at that point. I don't think Bismarck would have had much of an operational career basing itself out of French ports, because it would have forever found itself being bombed while in port, subject to the occasional random torpedo bomber attack, and you can guarantee there probably would have been half a dozen Royal Navy submarines floating around just offshore, just waiting for one of the German ships to sail out again. Although, that said, Bismarck being part of the Channel Dash would make things an incredibly interesting little scene.
Definitely, but it would also probably make the Channel Dash harder to miss. But basically, I mean, that was one of the reasons for the Channel Dash, right? Because basically it was a retreat because the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were kind of dying the death of 1,000 cuts out there in the French ports.
Yeah,
basically, by the time one of them got fixed, the other was bombed, and
yeah, and poor old Gneisenau, of the two, definitely didn't have the good time of it. She very, very nearly got sunk by a Beaufort doing what it turned out to be a semi-suicidal torpedo run on her there. They managed to get her operational enough to do the Channel Dash, and then, of course, took her into harbour, and she got hit again very badly, and that was it for her. I think Scharnhorst was leeching all the luck off of her.
Yeah, they kind of they were caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, you can repair and refit in the French ports, which allows you to get out into the Atlantic a lot easier, but you're going to get visited by the Royal Air Force every night.
You just can't do much on when you don't control your airspace.
Yeah.
That's the lesson of World War II. Surface ships you can be spotted, you can be attacked, you can be scouted, you can be harassed. You can never accomplish your mission with any operational security if the enemy controls the eyes in the sky.
Yep. It was actually one of the questions from the Q&A that we didn't have time for earlier, which was what was the most significant factor. There were no massive surface engagements in World War II in the way that there was in World War I, and the simple answer to that is aircraft carriers.
Naval aviation, absolutely. Yep. That's why you couldn't concentrate your surface forces. Whenever it was tried, sortie of Yamato, you look at the sortie of the Japanese Center Force at Leyte Gulf. There's Task Force 38 there to ruin your day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there was also the small problem of the fact that there were more battleships at Jutland than there were on the planet by World War II, which kind of obviates against it. But yeah, and of course the Japanese, despite the fact they absolutely really, really wanted their decisive battle, then promptly went and made it impossible by sinking everyone at Pearl Harbor. By the time the US Navy was back in the Western Pacific, they went, oh yes, aircraft carrier attacks. We like this idea. Now we shall do it many times larger.
They were good at it. The Japanese were better than we were at it the first 6 months of the war, and until Midway evened things out.
Midway,
and then Mariana had the largest carrier engagement of the war. 15 U.S. versus 9 Japanese, and we all know how that came out. No more Japanese naval aviation.
Yeah, you did have the one advantage of having one aircraft carrier that couldn't be sunk, the island of Midway.
Why?
And then, of course, the US Navy finds the Essex design and goes, Control C, Control V, and then starts smashing the keyboard.
Well, I'm going to talk about the history. So there's the reputation that the US Navy was still, shall we say, in the battleship mode. The big gun admirals were still winning. Yet, if you look at the amount of carriers and the amount of naval aviation that the US Navy was doing, actually putting to sea, that's not true. There was a very significant influence of the aviators.
Well, I think even as early as 1940. Oh, Jim, you're the expert here. Guadalcanal. I was 1942.
42, yeah.
Yeah. They had the choice because they only had 2 or possibly 3 or 4 oil tankers available to the entire Pacific naval forces. And you could send the battleships or the carriers, but you couldn't send them both. And
Nimitz faced that choice. That's true.
Yeah.
And he realized the carriers were the arm of the war. At Guadalcanal, we found ourselves down to a single carrier. So after Santa Cruz, when Hornet gets capped and Enterprise gets damaged, Halsey's got the USS Enterprise, which is then forced to send his air group to Guadalcanal to defend against these last runs of the Tokyo Express, and was close run indeed. We fought the war at that stage with a single carrier in the whole Pacific. CD6 Enterprise was, damaged and alone. And our air group was sent to join the Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal. And those land-based aviators, went out and did what they were supposed to do against a Japanese invasion force, following the great surface actions won by Willis Lee and Daniel Callahan.
I believe
unsung naval hero for blocking the Tokyo Express and preserving the ability of those aviators to go out and sink an entire Japanese division at sea.
I believe there may even be there may even be a plaque on the wall behind you with the cover of a book where you can read all about this.
Oh yeah, how about that? Yes, I'm not so.
The Neptune's Inferno is definitely great for that.
And also that actually loops back to what we were talking about in the earlier Q&A about leadership and flexibility and training, because one of the many flaws in the Japanese approach at Midway was Shikaku and Zuikaku. Earlier, they'd had one had basically lost its air group, the other was damaged. Now, as you can tell from what Jim was just saying there about Enterprise's air group, the ship's damaged, okay, redeploy the air group to somewhere where it's useful. Whereas the Japanese approach was no, well, this is this ship's air group, so it's going to stay until we fix the ship. Whereas if they'd just gone, well, they're even sister ships. It's not exactly like you're asking a massive change. You could have just gone, put this air group on that ship. We now have an operational carrier and one that's being repaired and getting a new air group. But instead, they decided to keep everybody in a very rigid command structure, which then meant they were actually short 2 carriers, which didn't help them very much.
Well, you compare that, was it USS Robin? Was that the...
said what saved Guadalcanal was a loss with so many carriers.
Yeah, was it USS Robin was the British carrier that the Americans used?
Yeah, HMS Victorious, pretending to be a US carrier when they were just down to Saratoga.
The Robin.
Mm-hmm. It was a very, very interesting deployment, actually. The reports that come out of that for both the Royal Navy and the US Navy are very interesting. Both sides learning quite a lot from each other, and vast amounts of illicit trade going on of beer versus ice cream.
Oh, yeah.
I could imagine that. Yeah, that's.
First complaints.
Japanese destroyer spotted.
Is that Akizuki?
That's Akizuki. She wants some attention. Hello, little cat.
Okay, so the same way.
Probably all time to go feed our pets, huh?
The same way Cat stole the scene at the beginning of the stream, it stole a scene now.
That's right.
Yes.
Chat's going crazy.
There's no trouble at all.
How's your main battery, Jingles?
Devastating. You want to stay out of range, I'll tell you that for nothing. Doesn't pay to be a spider within 6 meters of her. She'll have you.
Amazing. Yeah, guys, so I think we'll start to wrap it up here. First of all, I want to say a big thank you to all of our guests here. It was a pleasure to have this stream, and chat seemed to have enjoyed very much, just like we did. I think it was a great stream, and thank you very much for all of your insights and information. So I'll just say thank you very much. If you have any final words, we'll just go through the guests and then switch back to us. So, Mr. Hornfischer, any final comments?
Yeah, well, it's been great. I learned a lot, and I'll see you all on the North American server. And you're all located here in Austin. I'm in Austin too. We should get together in spite of COVID here.
Yes.
I'm in San Antonio.
Oh, okay.
At some point when it's all over, I will be doing my American tour. So, yeah. I definitely be going to the Alabama. So, yeah.
I think this is a great plan. We should all meet up in Austin for barbecue. I heard that's the best thing you can get.
Oh, you can't
Barbecue
be in for
here
that.
is pretty damn good.
Now you're talking.
Yeah. One of the things I miss about when I moved from California to here, the Asian food here is terrible, absolutely awful. But we make up with it with the barbecue.
Oh yeah.
Try Wu Chow. Try Wu Chow in downtown Austin.
All right, I'll give it a crack. No comments here. It's been fun, and let's do this again sometime.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. It's great having everyone here. Yeah, of course, the only thing I'll sign out with is taking a look at the stream. Make sure to buy his books and watch. Which way am I pointing? That way. Watch his videos and watch his videos. And if you've got any life left after doing that, maybe come and watch one or two of mine as well.
Thanks, guys.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Watch him. Flamu runs his videos every Thursday. He does a Theatre Thursday on Flamu's live stream where he watches Drakenfeld's videos. And I've just realised I've mispronounced his name. Drakenfeld. That second I catches everybody out.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well then, guys, thank you very much, and we'll see you hopefully next time, because I'm sure we want to do this again. Thank you for taking the time, and guys, if you don't know these guys and you like their content, I can just repeat that shout out. Go to Drachen.info for any kind of naval history if you're interested in that. He has a lot of videos, and they're all interesting. If you like World of Warships content, Mr. Jingles has a channel where he plays a lot of World of Warships, but also other games. Feel free to check it out. It's always entertaining, especially Mingles with Jingles. And yeah, Mr. Hornfisher, as I've said, all of the guys who sent us questions will get, I mean, those we picked. Sorry, I know a lot of you sent us books, but I don't think we have that many books in stock here. We're going to contact you and send you one of Mr. Hornfisher's books. So please make sure to pay attention to your private messages on the forums. And now there's still something I have left to do, which is announce the winners of our giveaway that we were doing in the background throughout the stream. So I'll do that now. I'm not going to read out the 100 winners of the camouflages, because otherwise we're going to be here for another half an hour. But I'm going to read out the 20 guys who won something a bit more, interesting for them. So we have Alpha Lix with double X, who won the Alabama as a premium ship with the new Victory Day camouflage. Actually, Mr. Convoy, maybe you can bring up the scene where we have the camouflages in the background, so you can see actually what you're going to get. For XD Pyatt, he gets the Eagle with the new camouflage. Then we have Yulino Sadomi. He gets the Duke of York that we also saw in the parade with the new Victory Day camouflage. Then we have, I'm going to absolutely butcher it, Ayu Bailangayi won the Texas with the camouflage. Have fun with that ship. And then we have for the Oktyabrskaya Revoluция, Tier 5 Soviet battleship, goes to Beas_Pioneer. And then we have for the Minsk camouflage, the permanent one, the Russian dude, Lysander_20, highest double_caliber, Baz 44331, and Ensign_Cthulhu. Like the name. For the New Orleans permanent camouflage, we have Ich_bin_brain AFK_junior. Okay. Hopefully better in-game than your nickname. Then we have Dadoslo, Monk_the Cannon Fodder, and Dens 654 and Tiny Bismarck. Oh, Tiny Bismarck, that's cute. What is a Tiny Bismarck? Is it a buyer? I don't know. Please let us know. Or yeah, but it does get torpedoes. So yeah. And then for the implacable camouflages, we have Malinon, Slivirka, Sparrow 1969 with an E instead of an A, Slow Hand Q, and Night Brother 1022.
Congratulations, guys.
Yeah, congratulations, guys. You will be receiving your prizes probably towards the end of this week. Because we're going to go home soon, TM. But before we do that, I'll have to grab Mr. Conway from his little production desk and, make him move in front of the camera after switching back to our regular scene, so that he can also say a few words, because he has been doing, switching back and forth and coordinating with everybody, the super testers who were running the ships, with our guests who were doing all of the Q&A part, and with Mr. Tucky and me doing the cameras. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. It wasn't perfect, but I think it was actually, we got a really good shots in, and I hope you like the format. So, but Mr. Conway?
So here I am. But you know the curse of the sound issues, right? Whenever I leave there, they appear. But no, thank you very much for tuning in, guys.
Today.
I hope you had fun. I think we had a really good stream. I learned a lot of things that I didn't know before, and I can just echo everybody else. All of our guests have really interesting content in their own right, and you should definitely go and follow the YouTube channels, and you should definitely go and buy one of Mr. Hornfisher's books and see if you like it. I've read 2 so far, and especially the Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors really puts naval warfare into a very new perspective, and it'll definitely stop all of you asking if we can have crew on our ships in battle, because what happens to those is not pretty.
Yes. Just one thing, because I see a few questions like, where can we see the winners? I'll offer you the following. Tomorrow morning, when I'm back in the office, I'll just put the list of winners in the forum threads for the questions. That way you have, or actually in the publication, in the cross link for the publication for this stream. It is the easiest way. It is one place where you can find it.
Bye, chat.
Yes. I also saw a question about these camouflages. Oh, I have these ships. I don't see these camouflages. They will be on sale starting either tomorrow or on Friday. I don't know out of the back of my head. Usually shit goes on sale on Friday. So probably Friday. Also, there will be missions. Victory Day is also coming to World of Warships. So there will be missions where you can get some of these camouflages in-game, the permanent ones, right? So pay attention, play on the weekend. Also, you can get the 75 years anniversary patch for Victory Day. So, head to the portal as soon as the information is out there, as soon TM, you can find all of the information as usual. Please read our portal. I know a lot of you don't, and that's why you sometimes miss out on things. So pay attention to the portal. There's at least when it comes to missions and so on, read it. Get the maximum out of the game.
Or at least pay attention to the Game Center because we have the most important news there.
Yes, exactly. So chat, I hope you enjoyed this stream. If you have any feedback, please leave it in the same thread that I just talked about. If you go to the portal and you see the Naval Parade, publication, you can just click on it, and at the bottom of the page there is a discuss button that brings you to the forums, and you can just leave a comment saying either, hey, I really liked it, or I really liked it and I would like to change this. And obviously nobody would say I didn't like it, right? So but right chat right. Yeah, you even saw with Mr. Convoy's camera work, you even saw my cute little notepad file that I, because it's with these streams, like I have so many windows open with chat and everything. What? You
look at my chat window.
Yes, your chat window is bigger. Okay, Mr. Convoy, I'm happy that we settled this.
No, I sent you a message.
You sent me a message. Okay, let me double check that message. What did Mr. Convoy send me? Let me double check this in a second, Mr. Convoy. Mr. Taki, do you want to say something in the meantime while I'm checking what Mr. Convoy said?
Well, I'm glad that I was able to be part of this stream because, meeting all these gentlemen, at least virtually, was a great honor. And obviously, making this stream was a bit challenging, but it was fun. And I hope you liked our camera work. I hope you liked all the history talk. And if you really, really like the format, then maybe, as Chris said, leave the feedback, and maybe we can try again.
Yes. Yeah, for me personally, I really liked the first part as well, where we just did Q&A. I know for some it's a bit boring because it's not gameplay, but I think every once in a while to have an opportunity to talk with the very knowledgeable guys about naval history is really cool and something different. So we'll try to do that again. Not sure whether we can get all of these guys in the same combination, but we'll look into it if you guys would like to also just ask some live questions. Obviously, it's even worse than for our regular streams because, in our regular streams, I think we answer like 100 questions per stream.
Yeah, but they are usually like short answers.
Short answers, but these guys, they go into detail, which is great because there's a lot of knowledge behind it. So probably the amount of questions we will be to answer is even lower than for one of the regular streams, but you get a lot of interesting background information. Yes. If you had any gameplay related questions, I think the question that I saw the most was, hey, when is update 0.9.4 coming out? Because it's 4 weeks after the 0.9.3 and nothing is happening, no update video. So that update is coming next week. I can already tell you this.
And it's coming next week because basically now we had 2 weeks when we had Friday off in a lot of countries in Europe. So basically shorter weeks demanded some changes.
Yeah, it's it is what it is. So I think with this, I'm done at least with talking for today. Tomorrow we'll be streaming same time, same place from 6 to 8. I won't be. I might actually be watching from home while sitting on my couch and eating something nice, and have a lot of Droid and Tucky doing the answering tomorrow. You will see Mr. Convoy and me back in action next week for the update stream. We're going to start at 4 p.m. Central European Summertime in German. So if you want to listen to Convoy and me talk in a funny language, this is your chance.
Ja,
and then we'll
natürlich.
switch to English, obviously, from 6 to 8.
Das ist ein Update.
Das ist ein Update, ganz genau. This time not from home office, from Chrysanthos' living room. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, chat. We're going to raid somebody. we're not going to tell you who, because you're just going to, spoiler it for that person. But we want to break chats with our streams. We have 6,000 people here watching with us. So we're going to rate somebody from our contributor program. Go ahead to their channel. We'll bring you there and just say hi from Convoy. What do we say? Be creative.
Go Europe.
Go Europe. Okay, that's Mr. Conway. So we go for go Europe, and I'll see you soon, chat. Take care. Stay safe. It's still a tricky situation outdoors, so follow the guidelines. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend, and toodles.
See you soon.